Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where beauty wasn't just painful, it was downright terrifying. Picture this. It's the Middle Ages, and if you want to be considered beautiful, you basically have to look half dead. Think ghostly pale skin, sunken cheeks, and eyes so shadowed they might as well be bruises. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, it's just a bedtime story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know what time it is and where you're watching from. Always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a cold stone chamber, lit dimly by flickering candlelight. The air smells like beeswax and old wool. You sit before a warped bronze mirror, trying to perfect your look. Only, what exactly is perfect in the 14th century? First off, if your skin has even a hint of colour, you're already behind. Pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was mandatory. It screamed wealth. If you were tanned, it meant you worked outdoors like a peasant. Gross. But being pale wasn't enough. You needed translucent skin, with visible blue veins running along your forehead and chest. That sickly, almost cadaverous appearance. That was peak hot. So how did people pull this off? Mostly through a horrific combination of bloodletting and staying inside like a medieval vampire. You might smear on a thick paste of vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead to bleach your complexion. Yep, actual lead. It burned, corroded your skin, and eventually poisoned your bloodstream, but hey, you looked aristocratic doing it. One historical example that stands out is Queen Elizabeth of York. Portraits of her show an impossibly pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark eyes framed by a high forehead. All textbook beautiful at the time, but scholars argue whether these depictions were real or just artistic wish fulfillment. Maybe she looked like that, maybe she didn't. What we do know is that looking like death warmed over was a whole aesthetic, and women leaned hard into it. Now imagine trying to achieve that signature sunken cheek look. In a time before contouring kits, you'd resort to actual starvation. Wealthy women were known to limit their food not only to stay thin, but to maintain that slightly hollow, ethereal face shape. Some would even suck on lemons or rub them on their skin, hoping the acid would drain some of the plumpness from their cheeks. Sounds made up, right? Nope. That's a real medieval tip passed from lady to lady. Let's not forget the role of the artist. Medieval painters weren't exactly going for realism. The faces they painted were filtered through layers of religious expectation and class-based fantasy. Smooth, deathly skin. That wasn't just beautiful, it was holy. A pure soul had to live in a pure body, and that meant no flaws, no colour, no warmth. If you were lucky, the local painter would throw in some gold leaf to brighten up your halo. Otherwise, you were stuck looking like a very fashionable ghost. But here's the strange, almost comedic twist. While noble women were desperately trying to look pale and frail, peasant women were actually, alive. They had sun-kissed skin from working the fields, muscular arms from hauling water, and rosy cheeks from real oxygen. To the elite, this was horrifying. To us, honestly kind of refreshing. Still, the divide was serious business. If a noble woman got too much sun and her skin darkened, it could actually be scandalous. She might lose status, or worse, be assumed to be slipping morally. That's how tightly beauty and virtue were knotted together. Your face didn't just speak for you, it shouted your whole identity, and if it didn't conform to the cold, pale standard, society made sure you knew it. Now here's a quirky little tidbit. There was a trend, especially in northern Italy, of using leeches for both medical and beauty reasons. Want to get rid of a pimple or lighten your skin a few shades? Slap a few leeches on your face and let them do their thing. People genuinely believed the blood they sucked out would carry away impurities. Scientific? Not even close. Painful? Absolutely. Effective? Debatable. And speaking of debates, there's an ongoing scholarly discussion around whether this whole beauty ideal was enforced more through actual fashion practices or through literature and art. Some historians argue that most women never really adopted these looks fully. It was more aspirational than literal. Others suggest that many upper-class women, especially in court, took these standards very seriously and actually altered their bodies and routines to meet them. Which side is right? We may never know. Diaries from that time are rare, and beauty wasn't something people wrote about candidly. It was just expected. But that's the thing. The brutality of these standards wasn't in the actual lead creams or the starvation tactics. It was in the silence. There was no escape, no "do you girl" movement. If you didn't conform, you weren't just unfashionable, you were suspect. Maybe sinful, maybe diseased, maybe both. So you stare at your reflection in that blurry mirror. Your skin stings from the vinegar, your cheeks ache from being hollowed by fasting, the candle flickers and you catch your face from a differy. Let's not forget the eyebrows. They had to go too. Women tweezed them until only a faint shadow remained. This wasn't because they hated expression. It's because eyebrows were seen as distracting, even vulgar. A woman's face was supposed to be a clean slate, like a holy relic or a statue. Emotions were messy. Emotions made you human, and being human was kind of frowned upon. And here's a weird one. Some women didn't just stop at hair removal, they actually dyed their scalp and the remaining fringe of hair around the forehead to make the skin look even whiter by contrast. Imagine applying a layer of white chalk or powdered bone dust just above your eyebrows, so the whole face glowed with unnatural paleness. It wasn't flattering, it wasn't realistic, it was expected. Of course, none of this was painless. Infection was common, the tools were primitive, the hygiene questionable, and any slip of the hand could mean an open wound or raw skin. And don't even think about taking a break from this routine. Let your hairline creep forward even a little and the whispers start. Is she getting lazy? Has she lost her virtue? Maybe she's poor, maybe worse. Now, not everyone bought into this madness. In some corners of medieval Europe, especially rural areas, women gave this trend a hard pass. They had more pressing concerns, like not freezing to death or dying in childbirth. But among the nobility, in courts from Paris to London, this was the standard. Beauty wasn't just visual, it was a social contract. Break it, and you risk losing your marriage prospects, your reputation, even your inheritance. Historians still argue about just how widespread this forehead obsession was. Some say it was limited to fashion-obsessed courts, others believe it trickled down into middle-class households, where women imitated the elite out of aspiration or desperation. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, like most things in history. But what's undeniable is that the high forehead became a kind of cultural shorthand for femininity, virtue, and aristocratic grace. It's unsettling, really. In a world where women had so few choices, controlling your appearance became one of the only ways to assert identity. But even that choice was a trap. You weren't choosing how to look, you were choosing how to suffer. So you lean forward in your candlelit mirror, skin burning from the vinegar, and your scalp red from plucking. Your hairline is high enough now to pass inspection, and your eyebrows are barely visible. You look serene, silent, unreadable, and honestly kind of haunted. Okay, so your skin is sufficiently pale? Great. You've managed to look like a walking manuscript illustration of a ghost. But now it's time to tackle something even weirder. Your forehead. Yes, your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, the higher it was, the hotter you were. And if you think today's contouring routines are extreme, get ready. Because now you're plucking back your hairline, literally, with tweezers, one hair at a time. This isn't a joke. The ideal medieval woman had a forehead that stretched halfway to her scalp. It was seen as a sign of intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity. And to get that look, women plucked, shaved, or even rubbed their skin raw with walnut oil, or bandages soaked in vinegar to make the hair fall out. Eyebrows? Gone. Baby hairs? Exiled. Sometimes they even shaved the top of their head back an inch or two, just to push that hairline even further. Think of it as the original five-head, and it was goals. The idea behind this forehead fetish is still debated by historians. Was it rooted in actual beauty ideals, or did it stem from religious iconography? Many depictions of the Virgin Mary showed her with a high, smooth forehead. No surprise, considering the church controlled most of art and culture. So women were expected to model themselves quite literally after the divine. A smooth, expressionless brow symbolized a calm, controlled nature. You weren't supposed to look emotional, you were supposed to look serene. Now imagine the daily maintenance. You sit by the hearth in the dim light of early morning, tweezers in hand, yanking out strands of hair while trying not to cry. Because if you cry, your skin gets puffy, and then you'll have to smear crushed rose petals under your eyes to reduce swelling. Beauty, in this world, is a job, and you don't get days off. There's a wonderfully strange case from medieval France involving a noblewoman named Isabeau of Bavaria. According to legend, and okay, maybe some dramatised accounts, she plucked her hairline so aggressively that it permanently damaged the follicles on her scalp. For years afterward, she wore elaborate headdresses to hide the irregular patches. These headpieces got so big and heavy that they eventually caused neck problems. And no, they didn't have chiropractors back then, just prayer. Speaking of headgear, the high forehead wasn't working alone. It came packaged with elaborate wimples, hennins and snoods, all of which helped frame and emphasise the forehead. The hennin, that cone-shaped princess hat you've seen in fairy tales, was often worn tilted back so the forehead was front and centre. Bonus points if your forehead was visibly veiny. That meant your skin was thin and delicate, like parchment, and everyone loved parchment. What's particularly funny and kind of awful is that even if you didn't have the right kind of forehead, you still had to pretend. Portrait artists would draw your face elongated and your brow exaggerated, whether you liked it or not. In fact, some modern historians now suspect that many of those ideal proportions in medieval portraits weren't real at all. They were edited the way Instagram filters smooth out your features today. The more things change, right? Events. No one wanted to be that woman at court, the one with the pretty face and dragon breath. Now here's where it gets stranger. In some medieval courts, there was an unspoken code about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest version. Something Mona Lisa level. No open laughter. That would reveal too much. Plus, joy wasn't considered especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal, slightly sad, like you were waiting for your husband to return from war, or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic than that risked being seen as inappropriate. There's even a fringe theory among historians, definitely debated, that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter. The idea being that joy made the face contort, which could reveal teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was a formal instruction or just a result of relentless social pressure, we may never know. But the concept of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked, it was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to figure out how to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly pitied. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible molars to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain, the risk of infection, worth it apparently for the chance of a good marriage. It wasn't all hopeless though. Some medieval beauty manuals, rare ones tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentle remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without completely destroying your mouth. One such manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, that's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far, and yet it's the quiet cruelty that lingers. The idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything, your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing, even when something's funny. Because beauty in this time, it's not joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry. That just means it's working. Your forehead is now the envy of every noblewoman from London to Lubeck. You've sacrificed your eyebrows, your scalp, and probably your sanity, but you're finally achieving that prized look. A pale, expressionless canvas ready to be admired and judged. But don't think you can relax just yet. Tonight, we descend further into the mouth of madness. We're talking teeth. Tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth that never show, never smile too widely, and absolutely must not look like you've ever eaten anything harder than a grape. In medieval beauty lore, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to be there, obviously, but it shouldn't do much. No loud laughing, no toothy grins, No yelling across the courtyard because your goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, demure, mysterious. And teeth? The smaller the better. Ideally, your teeth were white, small, evenly spaced, and invisible 90% of the time. If someone actually saw your teeth, you were doing femininity wrong. This standard was rooted in more than just aesthetic taste. It had moral implications. A small closed mouth was considered a sign of modesty and self-control. Large teeth, or a wide mouth by contrast, were associated with gluttony, vulgarity, and sometimes even sexual promiscuity. Women with big mouths were seen as loud, opinionated, or worst of all, unladylike. The goal was to seem like you barely existed, just a soft breeze of a person with delicate bone structure and no opinions. Fun times. There's a fascinating passage in a 14th century French romance where the male hero praises the heroine's beauty by saying her teeth are so fine and small they would not break the skin of a grape. Romantic, right? Unless you're eating steak. Then, you're doomed. It's hard to chew nobly when your teeth are functionally ornamental. But medieval oral hygiene? Yeah, that was another nightmare altogether. They didn't exactly have Colgate. People used a mix of herbs, vinegar, salt, and even burnt rosemary ash to scrub their teeth, assuming they even bothered. Most commoners didn't. Among the elite it was a little more common, but the focus was more on appearance than health. So while you might rub your gums raw trying to whiten your teeth, the idea of actually preventing tooth decay? That wasn't the priority. Which leads us to one of the more ironic tragedies of the period. The women who tried the hardest to maintain their teeth often did the most damage. There are records of women using ground coral and brick dust to polish their enamel. Yes, brick dust. It looked good, until their enamel was completely gone and their teeth began crumbling in their gums. The ultimate in medieval beauty. Small, pearly teeth that eventually rotted out of your skull, but at least you looked pious doing it. Then there was the matter of breath. You couldn't show off your tiny, perfect teeth with breath that smelled like boiled eel and sadness. So, medieval women chewed herbs, often parsley, mint, or cloves. Some also used rosewater mouth rinses, which didn't do much medically but at least covered up the evidence of a questionable diet. In some parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and even sprinkle ground cinnamon into their mouths before social. You're pale, hollowed, hairless in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. At this point you should be golden, right? But no, because now comes the part that ties it all together. Being thin. Not just thin, but fragile, ethereal, one skipped meal away from sainthood. Because in the Middle Ages, looking like you hadn't eaten in days wasn't just fashionable, it was holy. Fasting wasn't just for monks and mystics. Among noble women, not eating became a badge of both spiritual devotion and social superiority. The thinner you were, the more virtuous you were assumed to be. A woman with a full figure might be considered healthy, sure, but she was also suspected of indulgence, gluttony, or even moral weakness. The ideal body was soft but slight, delicate but shapely, like a sculpture that might break if you breathed too hard on it. This wasn't some quiet internal practice either. In many aristocratic courts, fasting was flaunted. Women would attend feasts but barely touch the food, delicately sipping wine or picking at a piece of bread with exaggerated grace. It wasn't just about health, it was about power. Denying yourself pleasure, especially in public, sent a message. I am in control. I am closer to God. I am better than you. Now, let's talk about St. Catherine of Siena. She's probably one of the most famous examples of religious fasting in the medieval era. Catherine claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist, literally a piece of communion bread. Some historians today believe she may have suffered from a condition now recognised as anorexia, though obviously no one called it that back then. Her starvation was interpreted as divine devotion. She was canonised, and her image, gaunt, sunken, glowing, became part of the beauty and spiritual ideal for women for centuries. And here's where it gets even murkier. Spiritual purity and physical appearance weren't just connected, they were indistinguishable. A woman who was naturally thin and pale could be seen as blessed, maybe even saint-like. A woman who had to work at it through starvation, herbs that induced vomiting, or long nights of self-flagellation, was still admired, but with a different flavour of reverence. She was admired for her suffering. There are quirky tidbits too, like the popularity of something called holy anorexia. It wasn't a medical term, obviously, but a spiritual label applied to women who fasted to the point of hallucination and ecstasy. Some noble families even encouraged this behaviour in their daughters, seeing it as a shortcut to sainthood, or at least a way to increase the family's religious prestige. That's right. Starving your child could be a career move. And don't get the wrong idea, men were doing similar things, especially in monasteries, but it hit women differently. Fasting became not just a religious act, but a gendered performance. You weren't just purging your body of sin. You were proving that you were too holy for hunger, too pure for earthly needs. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a shrine. But let's rewind to the daily grind of it. Imagine waking up in your cold stone chamber with a roaring fire that doesn't actually do much. Your maidservant brings in your breakfast, a stale crust of rye and a cup of goat's milk. But you wave it away. You're fasting, which really just means keeping up appearances. Your head aches, your limbs are weak, but you smile, faintly, and go about your day. You faint during morning prayers. Everyone pretends not to notice. Among your circle of noblewomen, there's an unspoken competition. Who can eat the least? Who can go the longest between meals? Who can survive on herbs and broth and still stand upright at Mass? It's brutal. It's isolating. It's revered. Even the fashion of the time reinforced this. Gowns were tight around the ribcage and torso, emphasising a narrow waist. Lacing was used to cinch the body, not yet full corsetry, but an early form of it. Some gowns had no stretch and could barely accommodate a full breath, let alone a meal. The silhouette of the day was long, narrow, almost reed-like. Rounded curves were okay. Hips and busts had their place, but the stomach had to be flat, the ribs discreet. Your whole frame was supposed to say, "I exist on air and prayer." Scholars still argue about how far these standards actually reached. Were all noblewomen really starving themselves? Or were the ideals exaggerated by male poets, clerics, and artists projecting their fantasies onto female bodies? There's definitely truth to that. A lot of what we know comes from second-hand sources, men writing about women, artists painting exaggerated saints, religious leaders praising devotion while quietly destroying lives. But the physical evidence, where it exists, corseted bones, letters, manuscripts, suggest that many women lived these expectations day after day. There were also class divisions, of course. Peasant women couldn't afford to fast, nor would anyone expect them to. They needed energy to survive their lives, fieldwork, childbirth, constant labour. But the higher up the social ladder you climbed, the more your plate had to stay empty. The irony? The rich had access to food, and were praised for pretending they didn't want it. And just to drive it home, here's a weird little fact. Some women would chew food and then discreetly spit it into napkins to avoid digestion. That's right, pre-digestion food rejection. A casual, court-approved eating disorder centuries before anyone had a name for it. So now, here you are again. It's dinner time in your candlelit hall. Your lord is eating roast pheasant, a smell so rich it makes your stomach twist. You sip watered wine and pretend to be indifferent. Your gown is tight across your ribs. You haven't eaten a full meal in days, but everyone praises your lightness and your grace. You feel dizzy, and someone leans over and says, "You look radiant tonight." You manage a faint smile. You're starving, but that's the point. You've stopped eating, you've erased your eyebrows, and you've shrunk your mouth into a delicate, well-mannered smirk. But you're not quite finished, because now it's time to talk about the final, and arguably most unachievable layer of medieval beauty, purity. Not just physical purity, but the big one, the one that loomed over every girl from the moment she could walk in a straight line, virginity. And not the real-life kind either. We're talking about a fantasy version of chastity, spun together with threads of religious dogma, courtly love poetry, and more than a little wishful thinking. This is the virgin ideal. In the Middle Ages, a beautiful woman wasn't just physically appealing, she had to look and act like she had never even heard of sex. And if she was married? Well, ideally she still seemed virginal. The standard was ridiculous, ethereal and untouchable, graceful but completely innocent, mysterious but also morally transparent. Basically, you were expected to be a walking contradiction in a really expensive dress. It all stemmed, of course, from the religious climate. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate role model. She was seen as the perfect woman, kind, obedient, selfless, and eternally untouched. Artists and poets bent over backward to make her the centerpiece of womanhood. That meant real women, living, breathing, complex women, were expected to mould themselves into that impossible shape. Pale, passive, and pure. Let's put you in the mindset. You're 13, maybe 14, old enough for marriage negotiations to begin. Your mother has already warned you to walk modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and never speak above a whisper unless addressed directly. You've been taught how to sit with your ankles crossed, how to lower your eyes demurely, and how to say no, with just the right amount of angelic confusion. You've also been warned that even looking too interested in something, anything, might make people think you're impure. Passion, after all, was suspicious. Even your clothing reflects this bizarre blend of innocence and allure. Your dress might be modest in cut, but made from expensive fabrics that whisper privilege. You might wear a veil over your hair, not just for fashion, but because visible hair was associated with temptation. The more covered you were, the more good you appeared. Modesty wasn't just suggested, it was legally enforced in some regions, literally. In parts of medieval Italy, laws dictated how much skin unmarried women could show. Yes, they had purity police. There's this fascinating story about Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old girl canonized for refusing to marry and protecting her chastity to the death. Her legend became a popular tale for young women, taught as a lesson in devotion and moral superiority. In art, she's often shown with a lamb, symbol of innocence, and a face so expressionless you'd think she'd been mildly sedated. This, apparently, was the vibe everyone was supposed to emulate. Pure, passive, silent. And here's the kicker. Even your physical features were supposed to reflect your purity. Small nose, delicate and modest. Large eyes? Great, as long as they didn't sparkle with too much curiosity. High, smooth forehead. Of course, because nothing says virgin like an enormous blank canvas above your brows. Medieval writers described beautiful women with skin whiter than milk, hair like gold threads, and voices so soft they could not disturb a bird. That last one sounds poetic until you realise it basically means you shouldn't speak above a whisper. Ever. But let's talk about hair for a second. In medieval symbolism, hair was a loaded gun. Loose hair on a woman was associated with seduction, danger, and lack of control. This is why brides wore their hair down only on their wedding day, symbolising both virginity and transition. After that, it was covered or braided tightly, because leaving it loose would be like walking around with a neon sign flashing "might be a temptress." The rules were unspoken, but rigid. You didn't want to be mistaken for a loose woman, because the consequences were brutal. Speaking of which, the stakes for falling short of this ideal weren't just social, they were physical. A woman suspected of sexual impurity could be shamed, disinherited, exiled, even killed. It didn't take much. A rumour, a jealous suitor, an unfortunately timed encounter in a garden. For noble families, daughters were political currency. If a girl's virginity came into question, it could sink entire marriage alliances. So yes, the pressure was real, and yes, it was constant. There's a strange scholarly debate about whether these purity standards actually affected women's day-to-day lives, or if they were just idealised projections from male-dominated literature and religious doctrine. On one hand, poetry from the era is overflowing with references to untouched maidens and flawless beauties. On the other, real women sometimes found ways to work the system. Some used their virgin reputations as bargaining chips. Others faked virginity with herbs and clever storytelling. A few even went full holy maiden and joined convents to escape the whole marriage mess entirely. A quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments, basically the medieval version of a hymenoplasty. It wasn't common, but it happened. Reputation was everything, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. And yet, despite all these impossible expectations, women still laughed, gossiped, flirted, even loved. They wrote poems, traded secrets, and found moments of rebellion. But they did so behind veils, under layers of fabric, and always with one eye over their shoulder. Because in the medieval world, being seen as impure wasn't just a gossip risk. It could destroy your life. So here you are, sitting in the garden under the careful gaze of your chaperone. You speak softly, hands folded, eyes lowered. You're 13, but you already know the script by heart. You must be beautiful, yes, but not too much. Innocent, but not naive. Seen, but not heard. You hear a giggle from behind the hedge, some other girl, less careful than you, maybe whispering with a page boy. You tense, not because you're jealous, because you know how quickly that kind of thing becomes a story, and in this world, a single story can become your legacy. So you've nailed the holy trifecta: pale, quiet, and virginal. But something's missing. Your hair, your literal crown, isn't just dangling there by accident. No, in the medieval world, your hair colour could make or break your entire existence. And if you were truly aiming for elite beauty status, only one colour would do: blonde. Not honey blonde, not brassy yellow. We're talking luminous, sun-kissed strands of spun gold, preferably glowing like a holy halo under candlelight. And if you weren't born with it, too bad. You'd just have to fake it, even if it meant burning your scalp with homemade bleach. This obsession with golden hair didn't come out of nowhere. In medieval Europe, blonde was shorthand for purity, youth, and heavenly grace. Artists painted angels and saints with flowing blonde locks, even if they were depicting women from regions where blonde hair wasn't exactly genetically common. The symbolism ran deep. Blonde meant divine, blonde meant delicate, blonde meant you'd probably die young, and wasn't that just lovely? For brunettes and redheads, this was a problem, so women got to work with a variety of horrifying DIY treatments to lighten their hair. One method involved soaking your hair in a concoction of lye, alum, and stale urine. Yes, urine, before sitting in the sun for hours. It didn't always work, but when it did, you'd end up with dried-out straw-like blonde strands and likely chemical burns. Beauty win? Maybe. Nerve damage? Possibly. One particularly infamous beauty recipe comes from a 15th century Italian manuscript, instructing women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat's urine, apply it to the hair, and then sit outside with a wide-brimmed hat that had the top cut out. So just your hair would roast in the sun. The goal? Lift the pigment? The result? Sometimes it worked, but usually it just fried your hair into a crispy halo of medieval regret. And don't think you could just wear a wig. Wigs were rare, and seen as theatrical or deceptive, plus extremely hot and itchy under layers of wimples and veils. Some women used thin veils dyed with golden hues to give the illusion of blonde hair peeking through, but it was no substitute for the real thing. You wanted the shine, the shimmer, the approval of everyone from your priest to your suitor, and if it cost you your scalp, so be it. A historical example. Let's talk about Lucrezia Borgia. While she lived slightly post-medieval in the early Renaissance, her golden hair was so famous that it was sent as a diplomatic gift. Literally. Strands of her hair were preserved in jewellery and letters as tokens of power and allure. Whether it was her natural colour or achieved through early bleach jobs is up for debate. But the point is clear. Golden hair meant influence. It turned women into legends, or at least well-married nobles. Of course, this aesthetic ideal excluded whole populations. Dark-haired women, especially those from southern Europe or the Middle East, were often portrayed as seductive, dangerous, or morally ambiguous. In medieval poetry, a dark-haired temptress usually spelled trouble for the hero, while the golden-haired maiden was the one he'd take home to his castle. The racial and cultural undertones here are loud. Blonde wasn't just beautiful, it was seen as better. Now here's where it gets interesting. While the church pushed for modesty and chastity, the romantic literature of the time, courtly love tales, troubadour poetry, fueled the obsession with blonde hair even more. In these stories, the perfect lady was always golden-haired, gentle, and mysteriously sad. Men fell to their knees for her, sang ballads under her window, or died in duels defending her honour. Blonde hair became the symbol not just of holiness, but of high drama. So, naturally, women copied the ideal, even if they knew it was fiction, even if they knew it was dangerous. There's a documented case in 14th century England of a noblewoman who went blind after accidentally getting bleach in her eyes during a hair lightening session. Her servants testified that she'd been trying to match the golden shade of a lady in a painting, art imitating life, or life imitating art with a side of permanent eye damage. But the consequences weren't always so visible. Repeated chemical treatments led to hair loss, infections, and open sores on the scalp. And let's not forget the smell. Many of these bleaching agents, especially urine-based ones, left women smelling like a farm animal in high summer. You'd walk into court looking like Aphrodite but reeking like the stables. The things people did for beauty. And still, it wasn't just about hair colour. It was about what that colour represented. You weren't just bleaching your hair, you were bleaching your entire identity. You were aligning yourself with a mythic version of womanhood, one that was unattainable for most and deadly for some. Blonde was a shortcut to grace, to love, to heaven. And it wasn't fair, but then nothing about medieval beauty was. Historians still argue over how much pressure women actually felt to conform to these blonde ideals. Some scholars say it was mostly limited to elite courts and aristocratic circles, where women had both the time and the resources to ruin their hair for fashion. Others argue that the obsession trickled down into the merchant and middle classes, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, where visual culture was booming and appearance meant opportunity. There's even evidence that men played into this too, not with hair colour, but by writing endless odes to sun-haired maidens and golden angels. The poetic imagery set the bar and women were expected to meet it. Never mind genetics, never mind chemistry, just bleach, pray, and roast in the sun like a delicate glowing meatball. So now, back in your chamber, you sit by the window with your scalp still stinging. You've followed the recipe from that whispered beauty manual. The sun beats down through the open circle in your straw hat. Your hair steams. You smell faintly of lemons and livestock. A servant fans you lazily. You feel light-headed, but maybe that's just the fumes. Later at court, someone glances your way. Your hair catches the candlelight. It shimmers. For a moment you think, maybe this was worth it. Then someone else turns to look, and another. You smile faintly, and tell yourself not to scratch your head, because it still really, really burns. At this point you've probably figured out that medieval beauty was less about being alive and more about looking like you were slowly fading out of existence. But don't think for a second that this obsession with delicate looks meant people actually smelled delicate. Welcome to the rank underbelly of medieval beauty culture, where baths were rare, sweat was constant, and your nose was the unsung hero trying to get you through each day without fainting. First off, no, medieval people weren't completely allergic to washing. They bathed more than the myths suggest, when they could. But for noble women, hygiene wasn't always about health. It was about optics. You were supposed to smell fresh and floral, yes, but without getting wet. Actual bathing was seen as potentially dangerous to the soul, or even harmful to fertility. Plus, medical experts of the time claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you more vulnerable to disease, sin, or both. Because nothing screams medical knowledge, like blaming your bathtub for a plague outbreak. So what did women do instead of bathing? They perfumed. A lot. They doused themselves in rose water, lavender oils, crushed violets, and even spiced vinegar. Some stuffed their undergarments with dried herbs like mint, marjoram and thyme, basically turning their corsets into medieval potpourri satchels. Linen chemises and veils were also frequently laundered, more so than the body itself, in a constant attempt to trick people into thinking cleanliness was happening. And then came the masks. No, not COVID style, but scent masks. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic resins, and even garlands worn around the neck or pinned inside dresses. These weren't just decorative, they were olfactory armour. The upper classes understood that things stank. The key was to stink better. Let's talk about hair, since we just tortured it in the last section. If you thought scalp care was a modern obsession, think again. Medieval women often went weeks without washing their hair, instead rubbing it with scented oils to mask the natural build-up. Rosemary, clove oil and bay leaves were popular choices, not for cleanliness, but to convince people your head hadn't turned into a small ecosystem. One quirky tip from a 14th century beauty manual recommends boiling rosemary in wine and using the mixture to rinse the hair and cheer the brain. Sounds nice, until you remember how often lice made themselves at home in those braids and veils. Delousing was a constant itchy battle. Women used special combs, vinegar rinses and prayers. Lots of prayers. Now, not everyone could afford the luxury of smell-masking oils and herbs. For poorer women, especially in the cities, public bathhouses were a more realistic option, until the church decided they were too sinful. Because apparently bathing in the same room as other people was a gateway drug to lust, disease and moral collapse. Many bathhouses were shut down or heavily regulated, and women were expected to wash modestly at home using a basin, a cloth, and whatever level of shame they could muster. But here's where things get contradictory. Again, the same society that scolded women for washing too much also expected them to look and smell immaculate. Not just passably clean, but spiritually fragrant. Writers of the time would describe their ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain. Never sweat, never food, never, God forbid, reality. And of course, the pressure to smell right wasn't evenly distributed. Noble women were held to impossible standards. You were expected to sit through hours of court, layers of heavy clothing, stuffy rooms, and still somehow radiate the scent of divine approval. One wrong whiff, and suddenly the gossip started. She's been riding too much, someone might whisper. Or worse, she's not what she pretends to be. One historical figure worth mentioning here is Isolde of Brittany, the often overlooked foil to the famous Isolde in the Tristan legend. She was praised not just for her golden hair and pale skin, but for smelling like flowers even after travel. Whether that was a poetic metaphor or just the result of an extreme perfume habit, we'll never know. But the idea stuck. The perfect woman didn't just look good, she smelled like a meadow in May. Of course, there's a scholarly debate around how seriously we should take all this. Some historians argue that medieval people were far more pragmatic than the surviving beauty manuals suggest. That maybe the pressure to stay fragrant wasn't quite so dramatic. Others point to court documents, letters, and poems that obsess over scent as evidence that yes, this was a big deal. And when you consider how rare bathing was, it starts to make sense. In a world full of natural funk, smelling even slightly better than average could be a social power move. There's even an awkward fringe theory that certain religious relics, like the bodies of saints that supposedly smelled sweet after death, were exaggerated to support this scent-based beauty obsession. If even dead holy women were supposed to smell like roses, what hope did a sweaty, sun-drenched noblewoman have? So, it's morning again. You're standing near the hearth, rubbing lavender-scented oil on your wrists. A maid combs your unwashed hair, carefully pulling out whatever decided to move in overnight. You dab rosewater on your neck, tuck a sachet of mint into your bodice, and inhale deeply. You don't feel clean, not really, but you smell acceptable, maybe even good. Later in court, a knight passes close by and pauses. He leans in. "You smell," he says softly, "like the first day of spring." You smile faintly. You're sweating under your layers, your scalp itches, and you haven't had a real bath in weeks, but no one has to know. Let's say the lavender oil didn't quite do the trick, and your natural medieval musk is getting ambitious. No worries, because this is where you reach into your little wooden cosmetics chest and pull out the really serious stuff, your skin cream. And by cream, we mean a bubbling cauldron of ingredients so toxic, even your local apothecary raises an eyebrow. Tonight, you're diving into the glamorous and horrifying world of medieval makeup, where lead, mercury, arsenic, and vinegar were casually mixed into something you smeared directly onto your face. Let's start with ceruse. Sounds elegant, doesn't it? Like some French artisanal paste sold in a boutique. In reality, ceruse was a thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead, aged in clay pots until it congealed into a smooth, deadly cream. Women used it to achieve that perfect, no-blood circulating here look. Ceruse covered freckles, blotches, and the overall stress of surviving in a world with no antibiotics or civil rights. It made you look angelic. It also made your skin peel off in strips if you wore it too often. One documented case involved a noblewoman in England who used ceruse daily to maintain her famously pale complexion. Eventually her skin became so raw and damaged that she had to have her maid apply it for her, avoiding open wounds. Did she stop using it? No, of course not. Beauty standards wait for no one. She simply upped the dosage to mask the damage caused by the product itself. A vicious loop centuries before Instagram filters, and lead wasn't the only villain. Mercury too had its moment in the spotlight. It was found in spot removers designed to fade blemishes, age spots, or any sign of sun damage. The cream was applied at night, often while wearing a mask or wrapping your face in cloth so the product could work its magic. Magic here meaning nerve damage, tremors, hallucinations, and eventual organ failure. But hey, anything to get rid of that one freckle that keeps showing up when the light hits just wrong. Now, you're probably wondering, did everyone use this stuff? Number Cyrus and mercury-based creams were mostly used by the elite, because they were expensive and difficult to make. But where nobles led, others followed. Merchant-class women copied the look with watered-down versions, chalk and flour pastes or ground-up alabaster mixed with egg whites. None of it was skin-friendly. All of it got into your pores and probably shortened your life by a few years. What's fascinating and disturbing is how deeply these concoctions were linked to morality. Smooth white skin was more than just pretty. It symbolised virtue, wealth, and a soul untouched by worldly sin. Women who had scars, moles, or tanned skin were seen as morally suspect. There was even a belief that beauty on the outside reflected beauty on the inside. A clean white face meant a clean white soul. It's the original good vibes only aesthetic, except enforced with death paste. But wait, it gets worse. If your skin started to show the side effects of the poison you were rubbing on it daily, you'd be expected to hide that too. Blistering? Try a blend of rose water and crushed pearls. Skin turning grey? That's when you pull out the rouge, a toxic red dye made from cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide. That's right. To hide the effects of one poison, you applied another. Eventually your whole routine was just chemical warfare happening in slow motion across your face. There's a weirdly charming footnote to all of this. Some women, particularly those in remote or rural areas, opted for homemade masks made from bread dough, honey, or even snail slime. Yes, snails. People believed that snail mucus could rejuvenate the skin. It sounds outlandish, but fun fact, snail mucin is now in high-end Korean skincare. So hey, the medieval ladies may have gotten that one accidentally right. Still, that was the exception. For most, beauty was a ritual of slow decay. You'd wake up, scrub your face with vinegar and salt, apply lead-based paint, dab your cheeks with something red and questionable, powder it down with rice flour, and then pray it stayed on through mass and midday gossip. By evening, your face felt like a dry lake bed, cracking with each blink, each smile, each whispered comment about whose cousin was secretly in love with a monk. And of course, the cycle never stopped. The second you washed it off, your real skin looked worse, more sallow, more irritated, more human. You had no choice but to start again the next day, and the day after that, until your skin no longer had anything left to give. Scholars still argue whether these cosmetics were used primarily for beauty, or as a form of social control. Some believe the emphasis on paleness and perfection was a way to reinforce the power structure, nobles above peasants, women above no one. Others think women used cosmetics to reclaim a sliver of control in a world that offered them very little. By painting your face, you shaped your own myth, even if the myth was slowly killing you. And then there's the question of how men fit into all this. Noblemen didn't usually wear makeup unless they were actors or very, very French, but they were often the ones praising, critiquing, and setting the standard for what women should look like. Artists painted impossibly smooth-faced ladies. Poets sang about women with porcelain skin and berry-red lips. Clerics wrote moral treatises about how vanity was evil, unless it was beautiful. Hypocrisy, as always, was well dressed. So now, back in your room, you open your small wooden box. Inside, your cerus, your powdered cinnabar, your chalk, your oils. You look in the mirror, your skin is blotchy, your cheeks raw. You dab, you blend, you smooth. You create the illusion of health, virtue, perfection. Later, as you walk through the hall, someone comments, "Your skin is like ivory." You smile, and try not to think about how, by 35, your teeth might fall out and your bones could start to ache for reasons no one understands yet. But tonight, you're glowing. You are ready to make everyone in court assume you are just too delicate to exist in this cruel, cruel world. This ideal wasn't just about looking unwell. It was about hinting at something deeper. A woman who looked physically weak was often assumed to be emotionally sensitive, artistically inclined, and spiritually advanced. Men wrote poems about their lovers as fading roses, melting snow, and ghostly maidens. You weren't supposed to be of this world. You were supposed to look like you were barely tolerating it. Now here's the creepy twist. The beauty of the sickly look blurred the line between life and death. It wasn't uncommon for women to be compared to corpses in love poems. She lay still as marble, one poet wrote, her breath so light it stirred not the air. Romantic, right? Also mildly terrifying. But this was the mood. You didn't just want to look passive, you wanted to look perishable. A perfect example of this can be found in the court of Burgundy, where pale skin and sorrowful expressions became something of a competitive sport. Ladies would faint during church services, swoon during dances, and recover just in time to offer a small, trembling smile. One noblewoman reportedly claimed to drink only rosewater for an entire week before a royal banquet, so her skin would appear bloodless and divine. She didn't eat, she barely moved. She made a huge impression. Scholars still debate how much of this was conscious performance versus actual illness. After all, medieval Europe was crawling with diseases, and nutrition wasn't exactly balanced. A lot of women were genuinely unwell. But instead of worrying about that, society just aestheticized it. The line between sick and stylish blurred to the point where real health problems became a kind of fashion accessory. And if you think this trend faded with time, think again. The idealization of the suffering woman persisted well into the Renaissance, the Romantic period, and yes, even modern pop culture. There's something disturbingly timeless about a culture that praises a woman most when she's silent, fragile, and barely hanging on. Back in your candlelit chamber, you examine your face in the polished bronze mirror. You've applied your white powder, a touch of crushed berries beneath your eyes, and your lips are tinted just enough to suggest you might have coughed blood recently. Tastefully, of course. You lie back on your velvet daybed, draping an arm over your forehead with soft theatrical flair. Later, in the great hall, someone leans over and whispers, "You look so delicate tonight, almost like you're not really here." You smile faintly. That's exactly the look you were going for. You're glowing, all right, but it's less the glow of health and more the faint shimmer of chemical exposure. Still, in the flickering torchlight of the great hall, no one sees the damage under the layers. They see the alabaster skin, the veiled golden hair, the modest smile. You've perfected the mask. But tonight, we're going to talk about a trend that took all this delicate dying swan beauty and gave it a proper Gothic twist. Because for a while, looking sick wasn't just fashionable, it was practically divine. Welcome to the age of the sickly look, when everyone wanted to appear one fainting spell away from sainthood. This wasn't some isolated aesthetic. It was woven through every painting, poem, and whispered rumour at court. Women were praised for looking pale to the point of translucent. Hollow cheeks, dark shadows under the eyes, even a slight bluish tint to the lips. These were beauty markers. It wasn't about radiance, it was about fragility. The goal was to appear physically delicate and emotionally subdued, as if the weight of the world, or, your own corset, was just too much. The link between beauty and sickness wasn't new. In medieval Christian thought, suffering had redemptive value. Saints were beautiful in their affliction. Women who bore pain with grace were seen as spiritually elevated. So when you looked like you might swoon at any moment, it wasn't cause for alarm, it was cause for admiration. People assumed you were closer to God, more refined, more well-bred. It wasn't just a spiritual flex. There was a fashionable side to this too. The ideal courtly woman had thin wrists and ankles, pale fingers, a swan-like neck and a spine that suggested you spent most of your day reclining dramatically on a cushioned bench. If you had a cough, even better. A little consumptive glow gave your cheeks a gentle flush, and your lips a tragic hue. You looked like the heroine of a doomed romance, a medieval prequel to the Victorian tuberculosis chic. Let's talk fashion for a second. The gowns of this era were perfectly designed to exaggerate the fragile silhouette. Long draping sleeves and tight bodices made your arms look narrower and your waist smaller. Gowns were often cinched just under the bust, creating the illusion of height and delicacy. If your head looked a little too heavy for your body, that was ideal. You weren't supposed to look strong. You were supposed to look ornamental. Of course, you couldn't rely on clothing alone to pull off the sickly chic look. Makeup helped, especially lead-based powders that made your skin unnaturally white and powdery. But some women went a step further, using berries or beetroot to gently darken the under-eye area. That's right. They created the illusion of eye bags on purpose. Anything that made you look more tragic, more wan, more romantic was fair game. One particularly dramatic beauty trick involved gently pressing a cold spoon under the eyes to encourage slight swelling and bruising. The result? A soft, puffy under-eye shadow that whispered, "I haven't slept in days, and I've been weeping about my lover who died in the Crusades." Combine that with a fluttering fan and a strategically placed lace handkerchief, and, by now, you've mastered the look. Thin enough to look holy, pale enough to appear freshly embalmed and perfumed to the point of distraction. But just in case you thought this whole beauty circus was limited to women, allow me to direct your tired eyes to the young men of the medieval courts. No, they didn't get a free pass. Sure, they weren't bleaching their scalps with goat pee or smearing mercury under their eyes, but trust me, medieval masculinity came with its own punishing list of requirements. Tonight, let's talk about the impossible standards for men too. Because if you think your corset's tight, imagine trying to look brave, rich and holy while surviving hand-to-hand combat. Start with the basics, the medieval dreamboat. He's tall, but not so tall that he looks awkward. He's lean, but muscular, ideally a kind of wiry strength, like a sword with abs. His face? Sharp, clean-shaven, with a high forehead, yes, they plucked hairlines too, a straight nose and clear, unblemished skin. His hands? Delicate but calloused in just the right places. You wanted to look like you read poetry by candlelight but could still murder a guy before breakfast. So how did men keep their skins smooth and their features sharp in a world with no barbershops, no razors, and a medical system that thought sneezing too hard might summon demons? The answer, very carefully and often painfully. Upper-class young men used tweezers to shape their brows and remove stray facial hairs. That's right, medieval manscaping. Some even used vinegar-based tonics to cleanse their skin and avoid breakouts, since pimples were seen as signs of weak character or excessive lust. But beyond the face, a young nobleman's entire identity was wrapped up in his body, and what he did with it. From childhood, he was trained for war, sport, and the extremely formal art of looking cool on a horse. This wasn't about health or fitness the way we think of it now. It was about image. Knights and squires were judged by how they carried themselves in armour, how gracefully they moved during a dance, and how well they recited romantic poetry to a lady without tripping over their own tights. And yes, tights were very much a thing. In fact, men's fashion during the later Middle Ages was just as tight, restrictive, and oddly revealing as anything women wore. Men wore hose that outlined their legs and buttocks in excruciating detail. Codpieces became so exaggerated in some courts that laws were eventually passed to tone them down. A well-dressed man might spend just as long as his female counterpart getting ready, smoothing down his hair, adjusting his doublet, selecting his colours. Appearance was everything, and failure to look the part could ruin your chances of court success. One real historical figure who fit and broke these rules was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. He was the medieval poster boy for knightly perfection, skilled in battle, handsome, rich, well-dressed, and tragically doomed. His early portraits show a man with the classic look, strong nose, soft curls, and a fashion sense that screamed, "I'm ready for war, but also ready to pose for an oil painting." Later, illness ravaged him, and by the time he died young, he had morphed into exactly the kind of tragic male beauty medieval society adored. Noble, broken, unreachable. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic. It was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional. Devout, but not boring. Courteous, but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tightrope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labelled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mould was risky business. There's even a fringe theory, still debated by historians, that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticising women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet until you realise it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love, you had to perform love, like it was an art form, and a test of character. Quirky side note. Some medieval men wore beauty patches, tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes, or signal a certain fashion forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armour was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction. It was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking hot, even better. So here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking, like you've just dismounted a war horse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today," like a painting come to life. You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away, making sure your cloak billows behind you just right. Naturally, these clothes weren't breathable, so underneath all that finery you were sweating, constantly. And since you couldn't take off your gown in public, you just marinated in your own exhaustion. Your waist ached, your back cramped. You fanned yourself while pretending not to suffer, because suffering was part of the look. You weren't supposed to be comfortable. You were supposed to look transcendent. Of course, there were exceptions. In private, noblewomen sometimes wore looser gowns, especially when pregnant or ill. But even then, the standards lingered. If guests came by unexpectedly, you'd better be ready to relace yourself and slap on a veil. Your body was a billboard, and every curve or wrinkle was up for interpretation. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some young girls were introduced to lacing as early as age 12. It wasn't always tight, at first, but over time, the laces got snugger, and the expectations grew heavier. The message was clear. Start early, learn to tolerate discomfort, and become one with your body cage. It's tradition. And scholars still argue over how damaging this was. Some believe early bodices weren't nearly as restrictive as Renaissance or Victorian corsets. Others point to skeletal remains showing warped ribs and compressed lungs, especially among noble women who spent decades in structured garments. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Not everyone suffered the same way, but suffering was definitely part of the package deal. It's worth noting too that this wasn't always self-inflicted. The pressure came from all sides. Parents, suitors, the church, the court. Young women didn't just wake up one day and decide to lace themselves into immobility. They were told, explicitly or implicitly, that their value increased the smaller they became. And the tighter the bodice, the more marriageable they were. The more angelic they looked, the more admired they became. So here you are, in your chamber again. Your maid pulls the laces on your kirtle. You grip the bedpost. Exhale. She tugs tighter. You try not to flinch. Once the waist is cinched, she smooths the fabric, then helps you into your outer gown. It feels like armour. Heavy. Impossibly beautiful. Impossibly exhausting. At court you glide through the hall, spine straight, arms poised. You can't breathe deeply. You can't turn quickly. But you look exquisite. Someone whispers, "She's so graceful, like she floats." You smile faintly. You're not floating. You're being held together by 30 feet of linen and someone else's expectations. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic. It was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional. Devout, but not boring. Courteous, but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tightrope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And, of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labelled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mould was risky business. There's even a fringe theory, still debated by historians, that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticising women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet, until you realise it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love, you had to perform love, like it was an art form, and a test of character. Quirky side note, some medieval men wore beauty patches, tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes or signal a certain fashion forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous, but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armour was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction. It was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking hot, even better. So here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking like you've just dismounted a warhorse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today," like a painting come to life. You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away making sure your cloak billows behind you just right. Whether she actually did anything scandalous. Her mouth alone could suggest things the church would rather not discuss in polite company. There's even a record of a noblewoman in France whose marriage negotiations fell through after a rival court sent a portrait exaggerating her lip size. The message was clear. She was too sensual, too proud, too dangerous to be a wife. She ended up joining a convent. Her mouth apparently spoke louder than her actual words ever could. And then there was the matter of smiling. As we mentioned earlier, too much smiling was frowned upon, pun intended. A closed mouth was ideal. Slightly upturned corners, perfect. A visible grin, suspicious. A full laugh, scandalous. Open laughter, especially with teeth, made a woman seem less mysterious, less controlled. And remember, mystery was currency. Too much emotion, especially joy, was read as immodest, even unfeminine. Your lips were supposed to hover between silence and suggestion, never fully committing to either. But not all lip-related messaging was visual. Some women, particularly in the French and Italian courts, wore scented balms that made the lips subtly aromatic. Rose-infused wax, clove oils and honey-based glosses were popular among those who wanted to keep their mouths soft and inviting, without appearing too forward. Again, it was all about balance. You couldn't look like you were trying. You had to smell like heaven but seem like you'd never kissed anyone ever in your whole life. Not even a frog. There's a strange little fringe theory too. Some historians believe that lip treatments were occasionally used as a kind of flirtation ritual. A woman might dab a bit of balm on in view of a particular man, her fingers lingering just a little too long. He'd get the message, or he wouldn't. That was part of the game. The lips became both mask and magnet. Naturally, the debate continues. Some scholars argue that lip colouring was rare and mostly reserved for court performers, dancers, or women already labelled as fallen. Others insist that it was more common than we think, just done with more subtlety than we're used to. After all, most surviving records come from moralists and clergy, not the women themselves. And let's be honest, the women doing the best lip work were probably also the best at covering their tracks. So here you are again, seated at your vanity. You dip your finger into a tiny pot of pomegranate balm and gently pat it onto your lips. Not too much, just enough to catch the light. You blot with a linen cloth, check your reflection, then close your mouth into the perfect soft line. Not a pout, not a smirk, not a smile. Later, at the banquet, someone glances at you. His eyes flick to your mouth. You pretend not to notice, and you don't say a word. So you've powdered your face, starved your body, bleached your hair, and maybe even faked a fainting spell or two. You've committed to the look. But what if we told you it didn't stop there? Because long before the corset became the ultimate symbol of beauty through torture, medieval women had already mastered the art of physically reshaping their bodies with clothing. That's right. It's time to talk about the early precursors to corsets, the tight-laced bodices, the rigid kirtles, the bone-stiffened garments that squeezed women into silhouettes dictated not by comfort, but by patriarchy and pageantry. Now, technically, the corset as we know it didn't fully arrive until the Renaissance. But let's not kid ourselves. Medieval noblewomen were already living that laced-up life. They wore fitted undergowns, known as cottes or kirtles, which had to be carefully laced to create a cinched-in waist and an elongated torso. You couldn't just pull one on like a comfy hoodie. These things required help, servants, patience, and a willingness to exhale for no one. The goal was always the same, to make the body conform to the ideal. A long, narrow torso, a small waist, gently sloping shoulders, and modestly rounded hips. Not too curvy, not too strong, just enough femininity to suggest you were capable of bearing children, but not enough to imply you might be good at it. Subtle, contained, decorative. And don't be fooled by the romantic paintings. Getting into these garments wasn't elegant. It involved awkward twisting, sucking in your breath, and trying not to gag as someone yanked on the laces behind you. Often the cords would dig into the ribs or bruise the sides if pulled too tight. Linen shifts worn underneath helped reduce chafing, but not much. And remember, there was no elastic, no spandex, no mercy. One real-world account comes from the household records of the Duchess of Berry, whose ladies-in-waiting reportedly spent up to an hour a day dressing her, just the torso section. Her undergarments had to be adjusted multiple times depending on the activity of the day. Sitting for long hours, slightly loosened. Public procession, pulled tighter to present a figure worthy of devotion. Translation, she needed to look like an elegant tortured saint on wheels. And here's a wild little twist. In some cases these garments weren't just form-fitting, they were actually reinforced with stiff materials like reed, whalebone, or even metal strips. These weren't corsets yet, but they were moving in that direction. The fashion was evolving, the torture intensifying. By the late 15th century, some bodices were so stiff, women couldn't bend at the waist. You didn't sit, you reclined. If you dropped something, you waited for a servant to pick it up. God forbid you needed to run. But that was the point. Running wasn't beautiful, and we haven't even touched the layers. Over the tightly fitted kirtle, you'd wear a gown, sometimes two. The outer gown might weigh 10 or 15 pounds with heavy embroidery, jewels, and thick velvet sleeves that swept the floor. The idea wasn't to move gracefully. It was to move like someone being slowly ushered towards sainthood. Slowness was beauty. Stillness was grace. Movement was for peasants. Laced in, perfumed, pale as polished bone, you've done everything right. Or so you think. But tonight, we're zooming in on one last tiny detail that could unravel your entire aesthetic if you weren't careful. Your lips. That's right. Those two little lines of flesh on your face were a battlefield all their own. Because in the Middle Ages, lips weren't just for speaking. They were for signalling. And if you weren't careful, they could speak volumes about your morality, your class, your secrets, even when you kept them perfectly closed. Let's start with colour. You might assume that rosy, healthy-looking lips were all the rage. You'd be wrong. Medieval beauty leaned toward the ethereal, the otherworldly. Bright red lips were considered a little too lively, too earthy, too lustful. And lust, as we've covered, was a serious aesthetic no-no. A slight pink tint? Maybe. But anything darker could get you side-eyed by a priest or worse, suspected of intentional temptation, and here's where things get complicated, because cosmetics for lips did exist. Women used crushed berries, alkanet root, beet juice, and red wine residue to tint their lips. But this was a risky move, depending on where you lived and who was watching. Adding colour to your mouth could mark you as vain, deceptive, or even demonic. A lot of religious authorities believed that women who painted their faces were hiding their true nature, literally trying to trap men with false beauty. And the lips, being so close to the sin of speech and kissing, were prime targets for suspicion. One particularly damning piece of folklore described a painted woman whose lips were so red they bled lies. Subtle, right? According to some priests, lip staining was a sure sign of a woman who would lead men astray. Better to leave them bare, pale, unreadable. Because as with everything else in the Middle Ages, beauty was safest when it whispered, not shouted. Of course, not every woman bowed to the modesty police. In courts like those of Burgundy and Venice, where fashion pushed the boundaries of piety, subtle lip colour became an elegant weapon. A well-placed hint of berry on the mouth told the world, I am refined, cultured, desirable, but not vulgar. It was a performance, just like everything else. You weren't enhancing your lips. You were telling a story with them. A carefully edited story, one that walked the razor-thin line between saint and seductress. Here's a delicious little historical tidbit. In some noble households, there was actually a coded system for lip colour. Darker stains, applied very lightly, were reserved for evening events, especially when the room would be dimly lit by candlelight. In firelight the lips would appear flushed but not painted, warm but not wanton. Some beauty guides even suggested applying a first coat, blotting it, and then applying a second. Yes, medieval women invented layering. Take that, modern makeup hacks. But that wasn't the only secret language being spoken. Lip size mattered too. Small pursed lips were considered the height of refinement. They suggested self-control, discretion, chastity. Large or full lips, that was a problem. They hinted at appetite, both literal and metaphorical. A woman with generous lips might be mocked, gossiped about, or quietly avoided. Never mind. Your lips are silent, delicate, and maybe just the right shade of forbidden berry. You've mastered the face, the body, the posture, the scent, but none of that matters unless people know what it means. Because in the medieval world, beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was a walking resume, a moral verdict, a declaration of class and character. Tonight we're peeling back the gilded layers to look at the deeper and much more dangerous equation that governed medieval life. Beauty equals wealth equals virtue. Now it sounds ridiculous, but in a society where God, gold and gossip ruled supreme, your appearance did more than attract suitors. It told people what kind of soul you had. Smooth skin, that meant you were clean, both physically and spiritually. Pale complexion, you didn't labour in the sun like a peasant. You were preserved, refined, closer to heaven. Perfect posture, symmetrical features, white hands and dainty feet. All signs that you were born into the right kind of family, and therefore, presumably, born good. This wasn't just cultural fluff, this was doctrine. Medieval theologians and philosophers wrote treatises insisting that beauty was evidence of divine favour. If you looked good, it was because God had made you that way, on purpose, as a sign to the world. You were physically beautiful because you were morally beautiful, and the reverse was assumed just as confidently. Flaws of the body, flaws of the soul. Now imagine what this meant for anyone who didn't fit the mould. A crooked nose might mark you as devious. A birthmark could mean you were cursed. Too much hair? Might want to double check for demonic influence. Even scars from accidents or illness weren't viewed neutrally. They were read like warnings. People believed the body revealed the truth of the inner self, and that was a terrifying standard to live under. And let's not forget money's role in this mess. Because of course the ideal medieval beauty, like most things in history, was expensive. The lotions, the powders, the gowns, the delicate veils, none of it came cheap. Peasant women couldn't afford saffron hair rinses or imported perfumes. They couldn't even afford mirrors, let alone the time to sit in front of them. And so the ability to be beautiful became exclusive, a symbol of status just as much as a coat of arms. Even features themselves were linked to wealth. Thinness was often celebrated because it meant you didn't work the fields. Fragility suggested you were cared for, kept indoors, sheltered. Long fingers showed you never had to grip a shovel. Smooth hands said you didn't sew, wash, or knead bread. The farther removed you were from labour, the more angelic your body became in the public imagination. Now, you might be wondering, did people really buy this nonsense? Oh yes, it was baked into the medieval worldview. Artists painted noble women with flawless faces and elongated proportions, because that's what people believed virtue looked like. Poets waxed rhapsodic about their lady's alabaster brow or her slender ankles, not just to say she's pretty, but to say she's good. Her outer beauty confirmed her inner worth. One particularly illustrative case comes from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her ladies-in-waiting were chosen not just for their noble bloodlines, but for their virtues, a polite way of saying they were young, thin, pale, and composed. Court documents describe their beauty with the same reverence usually reserved for relics. Their poise, their elegance, their symmetry, all signs that they were not only suitable companions, but moral exemplars. Now here's where it gets really dark. Because this worldview didn't just reward the beautiful, it punished those who couldn't perform beauty. Ugly or disfigured women were often assumed to be wicked. Think witches, old crones, or temptresses in disguise. If you weren't beautiful, people didn't just pity you. They feared you. You were unnatural, dangerous, possibly unholy. There's even a recorded incident in 13th century Spain where a noblewoman accused her rival of witchcraft after she developed a facial rash. The logic? A good woman would never be so afflicted. The accused was later acquitted, but the damage was done. Her social standing crumbled, not because of what she did, but because of how she looked. And men weren't immune either, though the rules were slightly different. A handsome knight was considered more trustworthy, more heroic. A misshapen one, possibly a trickster or a traitor. This wasn't just aesthetics. It was a moral system enforced through cheekbones and clear skin. Of course, not everyone agreed with this madness. There were skeptics. Writers like Christine de Pizan, one of the first female authors to make a name for herself in Europe, openly challenged the link between beauty and virtue. She argued that women should be judged by their actions, not their appearances. Radical, right? She didn't win the war, but her words planted seeds that would bloom centuries later. Even today, scholars debate how much people actually believed in this beauty equals goodness nonsense. Was it literal, symbolic, convenient? Probably all three. It made life easier for the powerful and harder for everyone else. And that's usually how these systems work. Back in your chamber, you adjust your veil in the mirror. Your skin is powdered, your cheeks faintly flushed, your posture perfect. But tonight, you feel it. Beneath the layers of silk and meaning, there's a hum of anxiety. You've been watched all day, evaluated, praised, and silently judged. A maid brings in a letter, a suitor has written a poem. He calls you an angel of form and faith. You read the words and smile because you're supposed to, but you wonder if your skin was scarred, if your body was different, if you laughed too loud or frowned too often. Would he still see the angel, or just a woman? You've spent the day sculpting yourself into a living statue of virtue, powdered, veiled, well-mannered, and ghostly pale. You've learned how to perform wealth, display chastity, and shrink into the outlines expected of you. But let's not pretend this performance was entirely voluntary. No, there were actual laws, written, enforced, and sometimes absurd, that dictated what you could wear, how you could wear it, and what fabrics were above your station. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, medieval fashion police, where dressing too well could land you in legal trouble. Let's start with the basics. Sumptuary laws were regulations, often passed by monarchs or town councils, that controlled personal expenditures, especially clothing. These laws were meant to preserve moral order, but let's not sugarcoat it. They were mostly about keeping the lower classes in their place. You couldn't just wear silk because you liked the way it shimmered. You had to earn your silk by birth, marriage, or divine appointment. And if you dared to fake your status by dressing too well, that was fraud apparently. Fraud via fashion. For example, in 14th century Florence, women of the merchant class were forbidden from wearing belts made of gold or silver. In England, under Edward III, no one below the rank of knight's daughter was allowed to wear fur. Let that sink in. Your entire body could freeze solid during a particularly nasty winter, but if your father didn't own a certain amount of land, you'd better suffer stylishly in wool. Because if you wore fur anyway and got caught, you could be fined, shamed, or in some cases stripped of the offending garment on the spot. Nothing says maintaining social hierarchy like being forcibly undressed in public. And then there were the colour restrictions. Certain dyes, like Tyrian purple or saffron yellow, were so expensive and symbolic that only the elite could wear them. Blue, associated with the Virgin Mary, was often reserved for nobility or clergy. Red was trickier. Rich, dark reds were considered regal, while bright reds were sometimes linked to sin or sensuality. So a woman wearing a crimson gown might be seen as either powerful or scandalous, sometimes both, depending on who was doing the judging. It wasn't just about what you wore, it was about how much of it you wore. Layering was a big deal in medieval fashion, and the more layers you had, the more affluent you appeared. But too many layers, too much embroidery, too many jewelled accessories, that could be seen as vanity, or worse, arrogance. And vanity, as we all know, was a fast track to eternal damnation. There was always that balancing act. Display enough beauty to seem virtuous, but not so much that you looked proud. God forbid anyone thought you enjoyed looking nice. Even headwear came under scrutiny. The hennin, the famous cone-shaped hat, was so closely associated with aristocratic women that some towns banned its use among the bourgeoisie. Imagine being fined because your hat was too pointy. Some cities had clerks whose sole job was to wander the streets taking notes on who wore what, like a medieval Joan Rivers with a citation pad. A particularly bizarre case comes from 15th century Venice, where a woman was fined for wearing pearls sewn into the lining of her sleeves, not even visible, inside the sleeves. But the logic was that hidden luxury still encouraged pride and vanity, even if no one else saw it. It's like they were policing your intention. Thought crime, but make it fashionable. And these laws didn't apply only to the lower classes trying to climb the ladder. They also targeted women in general. Authorities feared that if women were allowed to dress too lavishly, they might become unruly, seductive, or, worst of all, difficult to control. So laws were passed specifically to limit what women could wear on feast days, at weddings, or during public festivals. Some towns even required widows to wear dull colours for the rest of their lives, because clearly grief isn't official until it's colour-coded. Now, there's a fringe theory among some historians that sumptuary laws weren't really enforced all that strictly, that they were more about sending messages than issuing punishments. In some cases that's probably true, but in others, enforcement was very real and very public. Officials would patrol markets and churches, keeping an eye out for fashion infractions. Tailors could be fined for making clothes above the client's station. A dressmaker might be dragged into court just for adding too much lace. And let's talk about lace. Intricate, handmade, often imported, lace was one of the clearest signs of wealth in a woman's wardrobe. But if you were caught wearing too much of it without the appropriate pedigree, you'd better have a convincing excuse. One London woman claimed she inherited her lace from a noble cousin. She was still fined, probably because no one believed a cousin would part with lace. But here's the contradiction that made sumptuary laws so exhausting. Everyone was still expected to look nice. You had to be fashionable, refined, elegant, but within limits. It was like being told to paint a masterpiece with half your colours banned and your brush under surveillance. Women were particularly vulnerable to this paradox. They were judged constantly, by clerics, by men, by one another, yet denied access to the very tools that would help them succeed in those judgments. And underneath it all was fear. Fear that blurred class lines would cause chaos. Fear that beautiful women would lead men astray. Fear that too much fabric or too fine a trim would awaken some dark anarchic impulse in the village square. Sumptuary laws weren't about modesty, they were about control, and like most systems of control, they punished the ambitious, the imaginative, the out of place. So now, let's imagine you standing before your wardrobe, a beautiful carved chest full of linens, velvets and silks. You pick out a gown. It's elegant but modest. A little embroidery at the cuffs, a tasteful belt. You slip it on, smooth it down and wonder, will anyone think this is too much, too little, too bold? Later, as you walk through the market square, a clerk gives you a glance. Not a smile, not a scowl, just a look. A knight asks her to dance, she nods. They pass you on the way to the floor, he doesn't look at you. You lower your eyes, you smile faintly, and let the crease deepen. By now you've survived your youth, your first marriage, your slow fade into social invisibility, and you've done it with grace, powdered restraint, and only minimal eyebrow regrowth. But what happens when you're no longer just overlooked, but actively feared? Tonight, we're entering one of the darkest corners of medieval beauty culture, the fate of women deemed ugly, unwanted, or simply not in line with the day's soft-lit ideal. Because in a world where appearance equalled virtue, to look wrong was to risk being branded something worse than unpretty, unnatural. Let's start with the basics. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was proof of moral and spiritual correctness. To be beautiful was to be blessed. To be plain was to be pitied, and to be considered ugly. That often meant danger. You were othered, pushed to the margins, and if you lived long enough to outlast both youth and usefulness, you risked becoming society's scapegoat. Think less, she aged gracefully, and more, let's check her for signs of witchcraft. The stereotypes were sharp. A hooked nose, suspicious, warts or moles, obvious marks of the devil, wild hair. You might be consorting with demons. Any combination of these features could brand you a threat, especially if you were poor, widowed, or lived alone. Beauty ideals weren't just about aspiration. They were about boundaries. Step outside them, and you became an easy target. There's a chilling record from 15th century Germany of a woman named Hilda, a midwife who was known for her sharp tongue and unkempt hair. After a local noblewoman's child died in childbirth, Hilda was blamed, not because of her actions, but because of how she looked. Her unkind features, her sharp bones, her evil squint, all presented as evidence of guilt. She was accused of witchcraft, tortured, and eventually executed. The case never mentioned medical negligence, just her face. And that's the horror of it. Medieval society wasn't kind to women who didn't conform to beauty standards, but it was ruthless to those who actively defied them. An aging widow with a crooked spine might inspire whispers. A woman with facial scars from illness could be avoided in the market. A girl born with a birthmark might be warned that it was a devil's kiss before she could even spell her own name. It's not just that people feared ugliness, it's that they interpreted it. Everything was symbolic. The body was a canvas on which God supposedly painted the soul. So if your features were asymmetrical, or you had a limp, or you weren't conventionally attractive, people assumed your inner life was equally twisted. You were angry, bitter, cursed. And women bore the brunt of this projection. There's even a 14th century treatise by a theologian who wrote that women who were unsightly should not speak in public, as their voices were as jarring as their faces. What a gem! And while that sounds cartoonishly cruel today, it was a very real sentiment in a time where silence, modesty, and loveliness were all tangled together into one impossible rope you were expected to hang your entire life from. One quirky and heartbreaking coping method was the emergence of what modern scholars call beauty confessionals. These were private letters or diary entries, rare, yes, but they exist, in which women documented their perceived flaws. A woman might write of her dull eyes or coarse hands, not to lament them exactly, but to express guilt, as though her lack of beauty were a failing she owed penance for. Imagine apologising to God in your evening prayers because your cheekbones never developed. But even in these harsh conditions, women adapted. Some leaned into their differences. Folk healers, herbalists, and cunning women, many of whom operated on the fringes of society, sometimes turned their outsider status into a form of power. If they were already feared, why not make that fear work for them? They cloaked themselves in mystery, gave ominous-sounding advice, and lived just far enough outside the village to make visitors nervous. Ugly became other, and other became useful, until, of course, it became deadly. You want real irony? Some of the traits feared in so-called witches, dark hair, arched brows, intense gazes, were also traits praised in courtly poetry when attached to the right kind of woman. If a duchess had sharp eyes, she was a fierce flower. If a peasant widow had the same eyes, she was a serpent. Same features, different story. The difference was class, charm, and context. Medieval beauty was never just about aesthetics. It was about narrative control. The fear of ugliness extended beyond the physical. A woman who was loud, assertive, opinionated, someone who refused to shrink, was also considered ugly in spirit. She disrupted the delicate illusion that women were meant to be seen and barely heard. And if she did it past the age of 25, she was labelled bitter, dangerous, unnatural. In other words, witch bait. Even the church piled on. Female saints were often described as beautiful beyond compare. while sinful women were portrayed as either seductively radiant or grotesquely hideous. There was no in-between. In sermons, priests warned men that evil women may wear the face of angels or of devils, which is another way of saying, don't trust any of them, but especially not the ones who look like they've lived. Habits, cutting down their meals, sleeping on uncomfortable beds, refusing comfort in favour of spiritual elegance. Some even wore tight cords or belts around their waists, not for fashion, but as symbols of bodily rejection. A corset of faith, if you will. One woman, Margaret of Cortona, was so committed to her penance that she wore a spiked chain under her dress. Her body was permanently marked by her devotion, and this too was beautiful. When she died, people collected her belongings as relics. Her pain became legacy, her broken body a monument. You start to see the pattern. Women's suffering wasn't just tolerated, it was aestheticised. And it didn't stop with fasting. Illness, injury, disfigurement, if framed correctly, could elevate a woman's image to something nearly supernatural. In some cases, actual corpses became objects of worship. Saintly women who died untouched were exhumed, examined, and, if they looked suitably preserved, displayed. Yes, displayed. You might walk into a chapel and see the mummified body of a nun laid out in glass, her bones wrapped in lace, her face covered by a painted wax mask of eternal youth. And people loved it. They prayed to these bodies. They kissed their coffins. They believed the closer you got to their remains, the more your own soul might benefit. The ideal woman didn't just die beautifully. She stayed beautiful after death. Corpse, but make it holy. Let's not pretend this was entirely about religion. There was a voyeuristic thrill in gazing upon these dead, delicate figures. Their stillness was seductive. Their silence was complete. They couldn't talk back. They couldn't demand anything, just like the perfect medieval lady, seen but never fully known. And here's the extra creepy layer. This obsession filtered into secular art too. Portraits of noble women often mimic the features of saintly corpses. Elongated faces, hollowed cheeks, calm expressions, pale skin with no blemish or pulse. The woman wasn't alive in the traditional sense. She was eternal, untouched by aging, untouched by flesh, untouched by you. It didn't stop at death. The beauty of saints often had to be defended posthumously. If a saint's corpse decayed too fast, it was considered suspicious. If she started to smell bad, even worse. The smell of decay was seen as a sign of corruption. That's why odour of sanctity became a thing. Some saints' bodies were said to emit the scent of flowers after death, literally the smell of roses, lilies, myrrh. Sainthood didn't just look pretty, it was supposed to smell pretty too. No pressure. There's one case where this got particularly weird. St. Zita of Lucca's body, which allegedly remained intact for centuries, was once examined and described in loving detail by church officials. Her tiny feet, her delicate hands, the state of her teeth, all catalogued like a bridal checklist. You'd think they were shopping for a wife, not preserving a relic. Scholars have long debated the meaning of all this. Was it about purity, control, the ultimate erasure of female agency? Probably all of the above. These saintly bodies offered a fantasy of perfect womanhood. No appetite, no resistance, no decay. Just beauty in the shape of surrender. But not every woman went along with it. Some rebelled. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, was canonized despite being loud, opinionated, and very much alive in her lifetime. She didn't shrink into pious silence. She wrote music, science, and philosophy. Her portraits show her with her eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, ready to speak. She was a rare exception, a woman allowed to be both brilliant and visible, but her kind was rare. So now it's evening. You sit in the convent's quiet chapel, candlelight flickering off the silver bones of a saint displayed in a glass case. Her smile is painted on, her face a mask of eternal serenity. Around you, other women pray. You close your eyes and fold your hands. And for a moment, you wonder, is this peace? Is this power? Or is this just the final form of disappearing? You leave the chapel in silence, the image of the saint's preserved face still lingering in your mind like smoke after incense. But as you step into the long gallery of the manor house, you're reminded that beauty didn't just live in the flesh. It was sewn, painted, and woven into every surface that surrounded you. Tonight, we're taking a detour into the visual archives of the medieval imagination, the art of beauty. Or more specifically, how beauty was filtered, edited and broadcast through the curated illusions of tapestries, paintings and manuscripts, the original medieval thirst traps. Let's start with the basics. Medieval art was never trying to be realistic. This wasn't Instagram, it was propaganda. Noble women depicted in illuminated manuscripts had impossible proportions, long necks, tiny waists, limbs like soft reeds, and faces that all looked suspiciously alike. Smooth, pale, serene. They weren't portraits so much as wish lists. Each figure wasn't just a woman, she was an emblem of virtue, status, and the aesthetics of the moment. In tapestries the exaggeration was turned up to 11. You'd see scenes of courtly love where women reclined under trees, playing lutes or gently restraining falcons with wrists more delicate than a breadstick. Their hair spilled in golden waves, their gowns floated like mist, and their expressions were frozen somewhere between holy indifference and bored eroticism. These weren't snapshots of real life. They were fantasy, stitched in silk. One famous example, the Lady and the Unicorn tapestry series. Each panel shows a woman in a surreal symbolic garden, surrounded by animals, jewels, and elaborate florals. Her features remain almost identical across the 6 works. Same pale face, same calm gaze, same mysterious smirk that practically says, "I've never pooped." She's not meant to be a person. So now, let's place you in this moment. You've aged out of innocence, and now you're aging out of visibility. You no longer draw compliments, just glances. The younger women at court don't ask your opinion. The merchants don't lower prices for you. The songs are no longer sung in your honour, and your mirror starts to look like it belongs to someone else. One day a child stares at you in the market and whispers something to his mother. You don't hear what he says, but the mother frowns and hurries him along. You smile as if you don't notice, but that night you sit in your room and trace the lines on your face. You're still here, still wise, still breathing, but in the eyes of the world, you've already disappeared. You've disappeared from the hall, from the marriage market, from the poems, from the hungry eyes of courtiers who used to bow when you passed. But what if you didn't fade quietly into the background? What if you leaned in, into the silence, into the thinness, into the pallor, and became something not just invisible, but holy? Tonight, we descend deeper into the strange and sacred world where beauty, death, and sanctity blur, where the ideal body wasn't just delicate, it was practically disintegrating. Welcome to the age of the heavenly body, where the most admired women were saints, and saints often looked like stylish skeletons. Now, we've talked already about the obsession with looking pale, frail, and on the verge of collapse. But religious women, especially those canonized after death, took that aesthetic to its extreme. They weren't just admired for being thin, they were venerated for being nearly gone. Their bodies were supposed to be consumed by faith, literally wasted away in devotion. You weren't just close to God, you were evaporating into him. Take St. Clare of Assisi. She reportedly fasted so severely that she needed to be propped up to attend Mass. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, her body barely able to stand, but in art she's portrayed as radiant, glowing, elevated. The physical toll of her fasting becomes its own kind of luminous beauty. She's not ill, she's transfigured. There's a term scholars use for this phenomenon, anorexia mirabilis, miraculous lack of appetite. In today's terms, we'd call it an eating disorder wrapped in sanctimony, but in the Middle Ages it was divine. Women who abstained from food were admired for their self-control, their detachment from the sinful flesh. It didn't matter that they were dying. In fact, it mattered more if they were. The thinner, the holier, and this ideal didn't stay locked in monasteries. It leaked out into the broader culture. Noble women who modelled themselves on these saintly figures would mimic There's a peculiar account from 15th century France of a noblewoman who insisted her maids stretch her face every morning using silk threads tied behind her ears. It didn't work, of course, but for a brief hour before gravity pulled everything back into its rightful place, she could convince herself she was still the belle of the court. That illusion was everything. And let's not forget the wigs. While not as popular in the medieval period as they would later become, some older women wore padded hairpieces or dyed their hair with increasingly desperate recipes. Onion skins, ash, crushed insects, whatever could bring a little life back to strands that had gone white with time or tension. But here's the cruel twist. Many of these treatments damaged the scalp, causing hair to fall out faster. So the harder you fought aging, the more obvious it became. And then came the social whispers. An older woman showing too much pride in her appearance might be accused of vanity, or worse, witchcraft. Yes, you read that right. There was a common belief that older women who seemed too alluring or too confident were using unnatural means to preserve their looks. Unnatural being code for uncomfortable reminder that beauty doesn't die quietly. In one German village, a widow was accused of bewitching young men with her lingering charms. Her crime, wearing red ribbon in her hair at 50. Scholars still argue whether this fear of aging was truly universal. Some believe older women, particularly widows, gained social freedom after their looks faded. No longer under the control of a husband or the pressure of courtly flirtation, they could own property, manage estates, and even speak their minds. There's truth in that, but it came at a cost. You had to sacrifice desirability to be taken seriously. You had to disappear from beauty before you could emerge as a person. There's also evidence that some women leaned into this invisibility. They dressed simply, kept their heads down, and played the long game. They became quiet powerhouses, advising younger women, manipulating marriage contracts, influencing politics behind heavy veils and soft voices. In some ways, aging became its own kind of weapon. But again, only if you stopped trying to compete. And in art, forget it. Older women were rarely painted unless they were saints, beggars, or allegories for sin. In the rare portraits that do exist, they're often shown with downturned eyes, heavily veiled faces, or hands clenched in prayer, an eternal apology for having lived past their moment. So tonight, you're sitting at your vanity. You see a faint crease near your eye that wasn't there last month. You touch it, gently. Your maid notices, pretends not to. She brings over a bowl of cooled rose water and a cloth. You press it to your cheek as if it might erase time. Later, at the feast, you watch the younger women laugh and dance. One wears a gown like yours from 10 years ago. Another carries herself the way you once did. Shoulders proud, lips modestly painted, eyes sharp. You just can't see it. You've been perfectly contained, face framed, jaw wrapped, body cinched, and you're still passing inspection. But here's the part they don't put in the love ballads or paint into the court frescoes. Beauty fades. Always. And in a world obsessed with your physical perfection as proof of your spiritual worth, aging wasn't just a natural process. It was a kind of public failure. Tonight, we're pulling back the silk veil to face what happens when time creeps in, when the skin sags, the hair greys, and the medieval world decides you've passed your expiration date. Let's get right to it. Aging was terrifying, not just for the person experiencing it, but for the people watching. A youthful face meant you were closer to purity, closer to marriageability, closer to divine favour. As soon as that youth began to slip, wrinkles near the mouth, crow's feet at the eyes, a little extra softness at the jaw, you could feel yourself sliding down the social scale. And for women especially, the descent was swift, cold, and merciless. The medieval concept of beauty was tied almost entirely to youth. Girls were married young, often as early as 12 or 13, not only because of strategic alliances, but because that's when they were considered most attractive. Gross? Absolutely. But in the logic of the time, a girl's physical freshness was directly linked to her spiritual and social value. Once she began to age, often by her early 20s, she was no longer an ideal, but a relic. Aging men had more wiggle room, of course. Grey hair on a man, distinguished. A lined face, evidence of wisdom and hard-earned experience. But a woman with similar features, often pitied, mocked, or feared. Older women were pushed out of the centre of court life, replaced by younger, more suitable beauties. A lady who had once been adored might find herself sidelined, no longer invited to dances, ignored at feast tables, or referred to with the gentle but soul-puncturing label of matronly. What made this even crueler was that women were still held to the same behavioural standards. You had to remain graceful, modest, sweet, and now invisible. If you tried to hold on to your beauty through makeup or elaborate dress, people talked. If you let it go, they still talked. You were either desperate or decaying. There was no winning. Let's talk beauty treatments. Yes, there were anti-aging methods, though none of them were kind. Women used harsh exfoliants made of crushed eggshells and salt to scrub away wrinkles. They dabbed their faces with mixtures of honey, vinegar, and ground bone to tighten the skin. Some even applied animal fat to fill out sagging cheeks. Nothing like waking up in the dark, cold centre of a stone castle and slathering yourself in goose grease just to pretend you're still 20. Devout or royal you were, modesty was a moving target. You could follow every rule and still somehow fail at being appropriate. There were, of course, wimples for every occasion. Daily errands, simple linen, religious festivals, embroidered silk but not too embroidered, mourning, black or dark grey, weddings, starched white, often with a crown-shaped coif to symbolise purity, and no matter the type, the message was always the same. Your head belonged to society now. Your hair, your neck, your breath, all tucked under a socially acceptable shroud. It wasn't just cloth, it was ideology. If a woman wore her wimple improperly, or didn't wear one at all, it was seen as a statement, an insult, a rebellion. She might be accused of vanity, arrogance, or even witchcraft. In one case from the 14th century Ghent, a widow who stopped wearing her wimple after her husband's death was publicly shamed and ordered to confess her sin of pride. Her real crime? Showing the curve of her throat. And this wasn't just an upper-class thing. Even working-class women wore simpler versions of the wimple, though usually just veils tied under the chin or wrapped loosely around the shoulders. These variations were more practical, but the expectation of coverage remained. In some parishes, public prayers even included thanks that women know their place beneath the veil. Charming. Now here's the twist. Women still found ways to make it their own. Some used fine linen, trimmed with lace or dyed pale blue as a nod to the Virgin Mary. Others experimented with folding styles, draping their veils to create flattering silhouettes or layering them for volume. And in court, women sometimes used semi-transparent fabrics to suggest purity, while still letting just a hint of their hairline peek through. In the right light, it could be both innocent and devastating. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much freedom women had to personalise these garments. Some say wimples were just another form of enforced silence. Cover your mouth, cover your neck, stay small. Others argue that women used them strategically, signalling status, emotion, or even flirtation through how they were worn. A loosened wimple could suggest sadness or vulnerability. A tightly wrapped one might announce piety or mourning, or maybe just a bad hair day. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Medieval women lived under strict rules, but they were never passive participants. So tonight, you sit before your polished bronze mirror. Your maid brings over a freshly ironed wimple, the linen warm from the fire. She pins it carefully at your temples, tucks it beneath your chin, and adjusts the drape at your shoulders. You feel the fabric press softly against your jaw. Secure, restrained. Like someone else's hand is gently reminding you to stay quiet. Later you pass through the hall, nodding politely, speaking softly, never lifting your gaze too high. A man you've never met says, "She has the face of a saint." You smile, small and serene. But you know he's wrong. You have the face of a woman. You lower your eyes, tuck your hands into your sleeves, and hope no one notices the tiny bit of forbidden lace hidden just beneath your collar. You're dressed exactly right. Or so you hope. You've checked your sleeves for contraband lace, adjusted the weight of your veil to fall within legally non-scandalous territory, and you've settled on a belt that doesn't sparkle enough to draw suspicion. But before you walk out that door, there's one more thing to manage. Your wimple. Yes, that oddly nun-like chin-hugging wrap that medieval women wore like a built-in apology. Tonight we're looking at the trap of modesty, quite literally. The social cage that came stitched into the fabric of your headwear. The wimple wasn't just an accessory. It was a statement, a requirement, and in some cases a sentence. It wrapped around the chin and neck and sometimes under the jaw, fastened at the crown with pins or tucked beneath a linen coif. Think of it as medieval hoodie made of rules and religious panic. Married women were expected, no, obligated to wear one in public. And in some towns, unmarried women past a certain age had to wear them too, because visible neckskin could apparently end civilization. The logic behind the wimple was this. Modesty must be visible. You couldn't just be modest in your behaviour or your thoughts. You had to look modest at all times, from every angle, and that meant covering your hair, your ears, your neck, and your jawline. Bonus points if you looked slightly like you'd wandered out of a cloister mid-prayer. Of course, modesty had layers. A young noblewoman might wear her veil slightly more loosely, allowing a glimpse of her hairline if she wanted to flirt with disaster, or the nearest knight. But even this tiny rebellion could earn a stern rebuke, or worse, attract the kind of attention you'd never want. In sermons, priests regularly reminded women that Eve's uncovered head had led to the fall of man. No pressure, though. Just don't forget your pins. Let's talk about where this started. The wimple was heavily influenced by Christian iconography, especially images of the Virgin Mary and female saints. These holy women were always shown with fully covered heads and necks, their faces framed in soft cloth like halos. Real-life women were expected to imitate this aesthetic as a form of daily devotion. And if that sounds smothering, it's because it was. Wearing a wimple could be hot, itchy, and impossible to manage on windy days. The linen would trap heat in summer and stiffen like parchment in winter. And don't even think about trying to run in one, unless you wanted to end up tangled in your own sanctity. A historical note worth mentioning, Eleanor of Provence, Queen Consort of England in the 13th century, was known for her elaborate head coverings, including heavily starched wimples that looked almost architectural. She set trends across Europe, though some clergy grumbled that her accessories were too ornate for a godly woman, which just goes to show, no matter how oppressive, the images shaped medieval self-perception just as much as they shaped public taste. A quirky example. In a few surviving tapestries, women are shown applying makeup or fixing their hair, proof that even inside the illusion, there was an acknowledgement of the effort behind the fantasy. One shows a lady using a mirror while her maid stands by with a jar of rouge. Another features a noble woman discreetly removing her shoe, possibly to rest her aching feet. A small crack in the perfection, but a telling one. And so, now you find yourself walking through your family's gallery. Painted eyes follow you down the corridor. You pass portraits of ancestors you've never met, each more flawless than the last. Gowns that seem to float, eyes that never blink. None of them look like you, but all of them tell you what you should be. You pause before one, the Lady Eloise, your great-grandmother. Her face is still and pale, lips faintly curved in a smile that's probably just the artist's flourish. She looks perfect. She looks nothing like the stories you've heard about her temper. You reach up and touch your own face. Your skin is warm, your eyes are tired, you're very much alive, and somehow that feels like a rebellion. You've wandered through painted illusions and stitched up perfection, seen yourself reflected in 100 faces that were never truly yours, but tonight we're dropping down from the clouds of courtly art and into something far more grounded, literally. We're talking about feet. Yes, the humble, often hidden, occasionally fetishized medieval foot. It turns out, even down at your toes, beauty standards lurked. And while most people didn't go around showing off their bunions, that didn't stop society from dreaming up elaborate fantasies about what made a foot desirable, or disgraceful. First, the basics. In medieval Europe, feet were supposed to be small, narrow and elegant, basically impossible for anyone who actually used them for walking. The ideal foot was delicate, high-arched, with well-shaped toes, and, ideally, so dainty it never had to touch anything unpleasant like mud, dirt, or, God forbid, labour. Which is hilarious, given the actual state of roads back then, unpaved, uneven, and frequently decorated with medieval surprises. But that's the thing with beauty standards, they're never about reality, they're about aspiration. And aspiring not to have to use your feet was apparently quite chic. So how did people show off something that was usually hidden under layers of cloth and leather? Through shoes, of course, and medieval shoes were doing the absolute most, pointed. But the barefoot image also had connotations of vulnerability, even sensuality. A woman with bare feet was exposed. Maybe holy, maybe fallen. Either way, she wasn't neutral. There's also the issue of smell. Let's be real. Shoes back then didn't breathe. Foot odour wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, which led to some inventive attempts at deodorizing. Some noble women stuffed their shoes with rosemary, dried lavender, or even slices of lemon peel to keep things fresh. One beauty guide from the 15th century recommends steeping the feet in wine and ash to cleanse them of both odour and sin. Whether that worked is debatable, whether it stung is not. So what happens when your feet don't meet the standard? You cover them. You keep them quiet. You don't draw attention to them unless you're certain they'll pass inspection. There's even a fringe theory that some women took to dragging their skirts slightly longer than necessary, not just for modesty, but to hide large or misshapen feet. Your shoes might sparkle, but only if your toes deserve to be seen. So here you are, back in your chamber, preparing for yet another long day of being admired while pretending you aren't. Your maid helps you into your slipper-like shoes, gently tugging the silk ribbons at the ankle. You wiggle your toes, sore from yesterday's feast. The soles are already worn, and the heels ache, but the shoes look divine. Later at court you sit by the fire, ankles crossed, feet perfectly posed beneath your gown. A knight kneels nearby, eyes drifting just barely to where your shoes peek out. He smiles faintly. You smile back. I wonder how long you can sit like this before the pain makes your toes cramp. It's morning again. You're up before the sun, not because you're excited to greet the day, but because looking effortless in medieval court life takes, well, effort. Hours of it. So tonight we're finally opening the heavy oak door to a place most men of the age never saw, the noblewoman's daily beauty routine. Spoiler alert, there's nothing dreamy about it. This was beauty through pain, a ritual of exhaustion, where glamour didn't just cost time and coin, it cost circulation, personal space, and at least a few layers of your skin. Let's start with the wake-up call. Your servant brings in a basin of cold water, frigid, because heating water means lighting a fire, which means time, which means no. You splash your face, grit your teeth, and then begin the process of cleansing. This involves a cloth scrubbed over your skin with vinegar, or a blend of wine and crushed herbs. It smells sharp, stings a bit, and leaves your face somewhere between fresh and faintly inflamed. But redness is better than blemishes, and as we've covered, your skin must say purity, even if your pores are screaming. Next, the whitening. You dab on your homemade Ceres, vinegar-aged lead paste, because pale isn't just pretty, it's the moral high ground. It goes on thick, cold and chalky. You smooth it with a piece of linen, blend as best you can, and try not to think about the fact that this will rot your face from the inside out in a few decades. That's future you's problem. Present you has a courtly luncheon to attend. If your cheeks are looking too bloodless, it's time for a little rouge. Crushed cochineal beetles or alkanet root mixed with egg white or animal fat makes a decent blush. You apply it in faint circles, careful not to overdo it. Too pink and you look like a tavern girl. Just enough, and you look like someone who woke up blessed, not busy. Your lips? Maybe a touch of balm, lightly tinted. Not too red. We don't want the wrong kind of attention. Then, the hair. If you followed the standard religious rules, you haven't washed it for a while. Instead, you've kept it oiled and combed, wrapped in linen at night. Today, it's time to shape it. If you're unmarried, you can let a little of it show under your veil. If you're married, it must be hidden. No questions asked. Your maid helps you brush it out, then plaits it tightly. You groan when she hits a knot. She apologizes quietly and keeps going. Once it's braided, you wrap it around your head, pin it into place, and slide on your coif. Another layer. Then the veil, maybe the wimple, depending on how religious the day is looking. Dressing takes another hour. First the shift, plain linen, then the kirtle, laced tightly at the sides, compressing your waist, your ribs, your breath. You brace yourself against a post while your maid pulls the laces tighter. You exhale when she's done, only to inhale and feel your torso hit a wall of stiffened fabric. There's no room in here for digestion or opinions. Over that goes your outer gown. Velvet if you're rich enough, wool if you're merely privileged. You check the embroidery. Any damage or pilling could be interpreted as neglect, and neglect is just a fancy word for moral failure. You select your jewellery, modest, unless you're trying to make a statement. You lace on your shoes if you can reach them. If not, your maid does it for you. She's used to it. Now comes the hard part, walking. The goal is to glide. You've practiced this. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, feet close together, steps small. No swaying, no bouncing. Your gown weighs nearly 15 pounds. If you lean forward too much, you'll trip on the hem. If you lean back, you'll strain your spine. And all of this happens while pretending not to notice you're dressed like a bedazzled sarcophagus. Breakfast is light if you eat at all. A bit of fruit, a piece of bread, diluted wine. Eating too much makes you sluggish. and sluggishness is unbecoming. Your stomach already feels tight under your gown. You sit with perfect posture while your husband discusses crops or politics with other men. You're not expected to contribute. You're expected to look vaguely interested. Then, appearances. If you're going to court, you must be impeccable. Your skin must remain matte, your breath fresh. You chew mint, suck cloves, maybe sip rosewater if your throat gets dry. You smile occasionally but never too broadly. You laugh only when it's safe. You speak in shoes called poulaines became a fashion craze among the nobility, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries. These things were absurd. Some had tips that extended 5, 6, even 12 inches beyond the actual toes, stuffed with moss or wool to hold their shape. The longer the point, the higher your status. They were designed for strutting, not standing, and if you're wondering how anyone walked in them, well, mostly they didn't. The ultra-wealthy were carried in litters or rode horses, while their shoes flopped majestically beneath them like limp baguettes. There's a surviving pair in a museum that literally curls upward like a curly fry. Functional? Number fabulous? Also number, but fashionable? Absolutely. It's a miracle no one tripped to death on them, though there are records of city officials banning excessively long poulaines during festivals for fear of public nuisance and injury. For women, the stakes were different. While men's shoes screamed, "Look how ridiculous my wealth allows me to be," women's footwear whispered, "Look how small and soft and unthreatening I am." A noblewoman's shoe was often more slipper than boot, narrow, flat, with soft soles made of leather or cloth. They offered little protection, which was kind of the point. If your shoes couldn't handle mud, it meant you had someone to carry you over it. There's a particularly wild example from medieval Paris where a noblewoman was said to have hired 2 servants just to walk ahead of her during rainy days, laying cloths down so she wouldn't have to soil her slippers. The image is ridiculous. A parade of modesty wrapped in layers of luxury, her feet never touching the real world. Like a saint, but with more attitude. Foot size, too, carried its own mythology. Small feet were praised in poetry as a mark of feminine virtue. Literally, feet like flower petals, or as light as swan's down. If that sounds impossible, that's because it was. And still, women tried to meet the standard. Some girls were encouraged to keep their shoes snug to prevent their feet from spreading. While not quite the bone-breaking process of Chinese foot binding, the intent was similar. Restrict natural growth for the sake of delicate aesthetics. Of course, most women didn't have the luxury of caring about dainty feet. Peasant women needed strong soles and practical boots to work fields, carry loads, and trudge through every weather. But even they weren't immune to foot-related scrutiny. Cracked heels or dirt-caked toenails could become marks of shame. Another reason why women covered their feet completely, even in private. Modesty didn't stop at the ankles. Here's where things get particularly bizarre. Some courtly love poems included detailed foot descriptions. Knights would wax poetic about their lady's arched instep, or the whiteness of her heel. That's right, someone out there was simping for a heel. In fact, there's a poem from 14th century Castile where a man literally describes a woman's feet as holy relics, which is a level of foot worship you probably weren't expecting from a guy in chainmail. And yet, the foot could also be dangerous. Barefoot women appeared in religious art, usually to signal penance or humility. Mary Magdalene is often shown without shoes, her feet dusty from the road, a contrast to the perfumed, jewelled versions of beauty preferred by the upper class. She's an ideal, an icon, and thousands of women were expected to somehow live up to her woven perfection. And let's not forget manuscript art. Illuminated books, especially religious texts, were full of miniatures showing women who practically glowed. Saintly maidens, noble wives, allegorical figures, they all had a strange clone-like beauty. Long golden hair, eyes downcast, lips barely there. Even when they were being tortured, as saints often were, they looked peaceful, ethereal, unbothered. Because nothing says spiritual triumph like being burned at the stake with flawless eyeliner. The artists weren't being lazy. They were following the script. The church, the nobility, and the artists themselves were all invested in maintaining a visual shorthand. This is what beauty looks like, and beauty equals goodness. So the models for these illustrations weren't actual women. They were formulaic. A checklist of the right features endlessly repeated across borders and generations. And this matters because these images weren't just decoration. They taught people how to see. A young girl flipping through her father's book of hours wasn't just learning prayers, she was absorbing a message about what she should look like. A courtier admiring a tapestry wasn't just appreciating craftsmanship, he was calibrating his expectations for real women. The art was both mirror and mould. It gets weirder. Some noble families actually commissioned portraits of their daughters that deliberately edited reality. Just like modern airbrushing, artists would elongate necks, lighten skin, smooth wrinkles, even tweak jawlines. This wasn't deception, it was expected. One letter from a 15th century Italian merchant to a portrait artist politely requests that the painter brighten the lady's eyes, lessen the nose, and improve the posture. Basically, make her hot, but, tastefully. Even men got in on the illusion game. Portraits of noble women often included symbols to reinforce the image. A small dog to show loyalty, a book for intelligence, a lily for purity, a tiny unicorn. Yes, unicorns were big in this era, for untouchable chastity. Every detail was curated. Every object served the story. You weren't just looking at a person, you were being told what to believe about her. But the flip side, real women could never live up to these images. No one had that much hair. No one's skin glowed in candlelight like a polished pearl. No one could sit for that long without getting a cramp. The art created expectations that real life could never meet. And yet women still tried, bleaching hair, tightening bodices, swallowing herbs to stay slim, practicing the perfect downcast gaze in case someone important looked their way. There's even a strange scholarly debate about whether these idealized images cause psychological harm. Some historians argue they reinforced damaging stereotypes and limited women's freedom of expression. Others think they offered a kind of escapism, a chance to imagine oneself as something more refined, more admired. But whether aspirational or soft tones, only when directly addressed. You sit for hours, stiff and composed, your limbs aching under layers of brocade and expectation. Midday means prayers, embroidery, maybe a stroll in the garden if your shoes can handle the terrain. You mustn't sweat. Sweat is common, peasant, and undignified. If it's hot, you carry a fan. If it's freezing, you pretend it isn't. Comfort is not your job. Grace is. By evening, your skin itches under the lead paint. Your scalp is sore from the braids. Your corset has left faint bruises on your ribs. You retreat to your chamber, where your maid helps you undress. One layer at a time, you sigh as the laces are loosened. You peel away the veil, the coif, the jewellery. You catch a glimpse of your real face in the polished metal mirror. Under the paint and powder you're tired. Red blotches have formed along your jaw. Your lips are dry. She helps you wash with warm rose water. You sit still, eyes closed. Then comes the ointment, something to soothe the burning from the cosmetics, though it won't really help. She rubs it gently into your cheeks. You thank her. She bows and leaves, and now you're alone. You lie in bed, face clean, skin tingling. Tomorrow it will all start again. The powder, the binding, the perfect steps, the watchful stares. Beauty isn't a blessing, it's a regime, a job with no wages and no days off. You close your eyes and dream, not of knights or gowns or whispered compliments, but of walking barefoot in the grass with your hair unbound and no one watching. Section 22. Morning again. The sun spills weakly through the narrow glass window, catching the frayed edge of your linen veil. Another day, another slow descent into powdered silence. But today's a little different, because today is a feast day, which means it's not just about being beautiful. It's about being holy and beautiful at the same time, and you know exactly what that means. It's time to channel the ultimate feminine standard of the medieval world, the Virgin Mary. Because in the twisted logic of your time, every woman is expected to look like a saint and a virgin, even if she's married, widowed, or 7 kids in. Let's start with the obvious. The Virgin Mary wasn't just a religious figure, she was the prototype, the default setting for female perfection, pure, selfless, gentle, and beautiful, but crucially, not seductively beautiful. Her looks were sacred, not sexual. So women across medieval Europe were expected to model their behaviour, their posture, and yes, even their faces after her. She was the role you were supposed to play for life. Virgin Mother Maiden, all at once, no pressure. acceptable marriage material. The Virgin was everywhere, on walls, in books, on coins, in sermons. You couldn't escape her. You could only try to become her. And of course, you'd fail. Because she's not real. She's not human. She's a symbol. And the moment you cried too loudly during childbirth, or showed too much ankle on the stairwell, or got caught laughing at a dirty joke, she vanished from you. Poof. No more Mary. Just another imperfect woman in a world full of judges. There's a scholarly debate about how much medieval women internalised this standard. Some argue that the Virgin was a source of comfort, a divine protector, a spiritual mother. Others see her as a tool of repression, an image used to force real women into narrow, painful roles. The truth, as always, is complicated. Some women found power in Marian devotion, others suffocated under it. Many did both. And yet, amid all this pressure, there were glimpses of rebellion. Women who played the role but whispered different truths in the shadows, who lit candles to Mary in the chapel and then snuck off to flirt in the gardens, who learned that you could wear a veil like armour, that looking holy was not the same as being obedient. So now, back in your chamber, your maid wraps your veil, smoothing the fabric so it falls exactly the way it does in the paintings. You tilt your head, practice the expression, serene, kind, distant. You clasp your hands just so, fold them at your waist. At the feast you sit quietly, eyes lowered, voice soft. A visiting bishop praises your modesty. A courtier says you shine like Our Lady herself. You smile, just a little. And think about how the Virgin never had to sit in lead makeup for 4 hours, or pretend she didn't know what wine tastes like. You've spent the better part of your life walking a tightrope strung between modesty and magnificence, piety and perfection. But tonight, let's shift the focus a bit. You've seen how beauty served the church, the court, and the whims of men, but what about the women who found ways to use that impossible standard for their own advantage? Yes, tonight we're entering the dangerous, glittering world of medieval seductresses, the ones who twisted the rules, sharpened their veils into weapons, and turned beauty into power, not piety. Let's start with the infamous Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, is often cited as one of the earliest women to wield her beauty like a political instrument. She wasn't noble by birth, but she rose rapidly through the court ranks by being unapologetically magnetic. She wore pearls, she wore fur, she wore gowns with necklines so low they made bishops sweat into their... In paintings, Mary is always the same. Pale skin, soft features, impossibly calm expression, long straight nose, downcast eyes, slight smile as if she just heard an angelic joke but didn't want to seem smug about it. Her hair is either hidden under a veil or depicted flowing in gentle waves of golden brown. Her body is long, her fingers narrow, her feet, when shown, perfectly clean. Even when she's giving birth in a stable, she looks like she's hosting a polite garden party. So how do you, a mortal woman navigating court gossip and itchy gowns, pull this off? It starts with the clothes. Marian blue is the colour of choice, deep, celestial, and outrageously expensive, since the pigment came from lapis lazuli imported from halfway across the known world. If you can't afford actual blue fabric, you settle for pale versions or just white. Modesty is key. Your neckline is high, your sleeves are long, your veil is adjusted so that even your ears are hidden, no hair escapes, no curve is emphasised. You don't walk, you glide, you don't speak, you murmur. There's an entire genre of beauty based around this celestial ideal. In religious poetry and devotional songs, the Virgin is described in ways that echo courtly love poems, only instead of stirring lust, she's meant to stir awe. Her cheeks are as fair as lilies, her voice like pure spring water, her body without fault or stain. These phrases aren't just religious, they're aspirational. Girls are taught to imitate them, not just to be good, but to look good in the specific way holiness demands. And here's where it gets tricky. The Virgin Mary is often depicted with her child Jesus, so she's a mother, but also a virgin. So while you're expected to marry and bear children, you're also expected to somehow maintain the look and vibe of a woman untouched by sin, desire, or time. You must be maternal, nurturing, serene, and sexually invisible. Congratulations, you are now a paradox in a headdress. One historical example that encapsulates this bizarre standard is Isabella of Castile. A famously devout queen, she modelled her public image heavily after the Virgin. She wore modest gowns in Marian colours, kept her hair tightly veiled, and was praised for her untouched beauty, even after multiple pregnancies. In portraits, she was always composed, pale, perfect. Her real-life personality, fierce, politically ruthless, and at times cold. But visually, a walking altar candle. And yet, this expectation was never consistent. In some courts, especially more cosmopolitan ones like Avignon or Milan, the Marian standard mingled with more sensual ideals. A woman might look serene and pure on the outside while wearing undergarments, embroidered with verses of courtly desire. Hypocrisy? Maybe. Strategy? Definitely. Women learned to wear holiness like a second veil. Useful, beautiful, suffocating. Let's not pretend this was purely about faith. The Marian image was also a tool of control. The church used it to promote obedience, chastity, and quiet suffering. Husbands invoked it when comparing their wives to impossible ideals. Parents used it to mould their daughters into, might quietly control land, servants, and commerce without ever raising her voice. Beauty for them wasn't power, it was cover. A veil not of linen, but of expectation. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Were these women truly empowered, or just clever prisoners in gilded cages? Some argue they were complicit in their own objectification, trading real freedom for temporary influence. Others believe they were rebels, subverting a system that gave them only one tool, and using it to carve out space where none should have existed. It's a complicated knot, and maybe the knot is the answer. After all, these women didn't invent the standards. They inherited them, like an old corset, too tight, beautifully made, completely inescapable, so they tightened it, posed in it, and made it work until it didn't. And now you're back at court, sitting through yet another feast. The room is thick with perfume and politics. Across the table, a visiting duchess tells a story with perfect timing and a slightly dangerous smile. The men around her hang on every word. She reaches for her goblet, slow and graceful, revealing just enough wrist to be remembered. Your eyes meet. She gives you a subtle nod. You nod back. And just like that, you understand each other. Not enemies, not friends, just two women in a game with impossible rules. You're back in your chamber again. The fire has gone low, casting flickers of orange and shadow against the stone walls. The feast is over, the gowns are laid aside, and your face is scrubbed raw of paint and powder. In the quiet hum that follows a day of display, you finally have space to think, not about how you look, but about how it all feels. And if you're honest, it's starting to feel like none of this was ever about you at all. Every rule, every ritual, every beauty standard you've ever twisted yourself into. It's like stepping into a gown sewn from other people's fantasies. It never quite fits. It pulls in weird places. And it's heavy. God, is it heavy. Sleeves. She painted her face, powdered her skin, and made sure her presence was unforgettable. She was both adored and hated. Proof that power in a woman's body made people very nervous. Agnes didn't just look the part. She played the court like a harp. She used her access to the king to gain influence for her family, promote loyal allies, and secure herself a lifestyle so lavish, chroniclers complained she wore the cost of a chapel on her sleeves. She's even credited with helping lift Charles out of a depressive slump during the 100 Years' War. That's right. While men swung swords, she lifted morale with a carefully timed smile and the glint of sapphire earrings. Of course, not all power came from such proximity to royalty. In Venice, the cortigiane oneste, the honest courtesans, were a class of educated, alluring women who blurred the lines between beauty, wit, and influence. These weren't your average tavern companions. They knew poetry, philosophy, fashion, and how to walk into a room like they owned it. Men didn't just want to bed them. They wanted to be them. Some wrote books. Others hosted salons. They dressed in gold-threaded gowns and spoke in calculated tones. Their beauty was curated, but their minds were just as sharpened. These women understood something most noble women couldn't say out loud. If you were going to be judged on your appearance anyway, you might as well choose the stage, control the lighting, own the script. One fringe case, a woman named Sibylla from Prague, reportedly used her exceptional appearance to gain audiences with merchants, clergy, and even travelling nobility. She wasn't of noble birth, but she reinvented herself through fashion, carefully layering imported fabrics, perfuming her skin with rose oil, and studying noble speech patterns. Rumour says she brokered trade deals in exchange for whispered flirtation, and maintained a network of influence so vast, one official wrote in a letter. She speaks less than a lady, but moves more than a bishop. This, of course, terrified people. Women weren't supposed to want power, especially not through beauty, which was assumed to be passive. To actively use it was seen as unnatural, manipulative, or predictably demonic. Which is how a lot of these women ended up slandered in popular songs, condemned in sermons, or accused of sorcery. Agnes Sorel was rumoured to have died from poison, possibly administered by jealous rivals. Many courtesans ended their lives in quiet poverty, exiled once their beauty faded. There's a bitter truth here. Even when women succeeded through beauty, the success was conditional, temporary. You could play the game, but you never owned the board. And the moment you stopped being desirable or obedient, you were erased. Just another cautionary tale in a monk's angry diary. But some women leaned into the art of performance not to seduce men, but to protect themselves. They weaponized beauty as camouflage. A noble woman with a reputation for grace could hide sharp intelligence behind fluttering lashes. A widow known for her quiet mourning. From the first time you were told to keep your voice low and your eyes lower, from the moment a priest compared your worth to a lily in bloom, perfect only until it isn't. You've been living inside a role someone else wrote. You were the maiden, then the wife, then the mother, then, if you lasted long enough, the widow. Each stage with its own costume, its own script, and it all came with rules. Too pale and they say you're sickly, too flushed and they say you're sinful, too thin and you must be fasting for heaven, too curvy and you're feasting on the devil's table. Your body was never your own. It was a canvas painted by priests, poets, portrait artists, and paranoid husbands. You've watched other women vanish into those paintings, become saints or scandals, sometimes both. You've memorized the poses, knees together, eyes cast down, smile soft, but not so soft it invites questions. You've sat beside dying mothers who whispered prayers for their daughters to be beautiful enough for marriage, as if survival depended on symmetry. In a way, it did. Because let's be honest, it wasn't just about beauty, it was about compliance. Beauty was the sugar that coated obedience. If you were lovely, people assumed you were good. If you were good, you were expected to stay quiet. If you stayed quiet, the world moved smoothly around you, but only as long as you stayed within the lines. There's a theory from modern scholars, well, modern by medieval standards, suggesting that the beauty ideal wasn't just a reflection of virtue, but a replacement for it. In a world where women couldn't own property, vote, or lead armies, beauty became their only real currency. If you couldn't be powerful, you could be pretty. If you couldn't speak, you could glow. But that theory assumes women were just passive vessels for male desire, and you know that's not the full picture. You've seen how women used beauty strategically, how they wielded it like a needle, sometimes to stitch alliances, sometimes to pierce ambition. You've watched courtesans charm warlords and widows outmaneuver bishops. You've known ladies who flirted with ruin just to feel seen again. But even those little victories came with a cost. You've seen women lose everything the moment they slipped. Grew older, said too much, wore the wrong thing on the wrong feast day. One day, they're luminous. The next, they're forgotten. And no matter how clever or holy or politically brilliant they were, their story is often reduced to how they looked. You remember Lady Evelyn, don't you? Perfect skin, sharp tongue. She once talked a noble out of starting a war. You overheard him say later she had a nice jawline for a woman with opinions. That's what he remembered. Not her wit, not her diplomacy, just the angle of her face. And it's not just the nobility. Even peasant girls were caught in the crosshairs. If they were too pretty, they were suspected of seducing the priest. If they were too plain, no one would take them as wives, and they'd become spinsters, mysterious, pitied, a little feared. Beauty was a weapon, or a wound, or both, and here you are, still here, still trying. You catch yourself checking the mirror again tonight, not for vanity, for survival. You're checking for lines, for colour, for that thing you can't quite name that tells you you're still in the game. You wonder how many other women are doing the same in rooms just like this. Candles burning low, hair unbound, faces bare, wondering who they are beneath all the paint. You think about what it would be like to stop, to wake up and not layer yourself in symbols, to wear something simple, to eat without worrying if your waistline will betray you, to laugh too loud, speak too boldly, walk barefoot without apology, to be seen, not as a symbol, but as a self. You close your eyes and imagine it, a world where beauty isn't a measure of your moral standing, where your value isn't tied to the width of your hips or the roundness of your cheeks, where your worth doesn't expire with your youth. In that world, you're not an allegory, you're not a virgin, you're not a saint, you're just a person, and for the first time in a long time that thought doesn't terrify you, it comforts you. Because maybe, even here in this world of laces and lies, you're starting to remember that being you, unpainted, unposed, unfiltered, is the most impossible, dangerous and beautiful thing of all. It's nearly midnight now, and your chamber is quiet. Too quiet. The fire's just embers, the last of the wax candles giving off the faintest warm glow. You lie back, head resting on a pillow stuffed with goose feathers, and the weight of everything, your gown, your thoughts, your entire life lived under the thumb of someone else's ideals, settles into your bones. But before we let you drift off, there's one last thing we have to talk about. Because the truth is, medieval beauty standards didn't die with the Middle Ages. They didn't vanish when the wimples came off, or when lead-based makeup fell out of fashion. They just mutated, hid themselves behind modern mirrors and digital filters, only slightly less obvious and no less cruel. Let's not kid ourselves. We've inherited the same toxic logic. The demand to be beautiful and pure, attractive but modest, youthful forever, even if it means pretending you slept 8 hours. You can scrub it off, step out of it, laugh in its face. You can let the lines come. You can keep your curves or change them for you, not for the echo of some nun with a paintbrush whispering modesty. You can decide your own reflection matters, not because of what it sells, but because of what it says. You've met every version of the standard, and none of them ever loved you back. So maybe now, in this quiet hour, with your hair unbraided and your face bare and no one watching, you can love yourself for something deeper. Not as a saint, not as a seductress, not as a symbol, just as a person with a heartbeat and a body that has carried you through this impossible, beautiful mess of expectations and still said, I'm here. So go on. Turn out the candle, close your eyes. You've played the role. You've earned your rest. Let the beauty standards fall asleep without you tonight, when you didn't. And the worst part, we still believe that how we look somehow tells the world what kind of person we are. Kind, competent, trustworthy, desirable. Good skin equals a good soul. Straight teeth and a slim waist still mean you must be doing something right. It's the same lie, just dressed in new fabrics. Scroll through social media and you'll see the medieval mindset everywhere. No makeup tutorials designed to make you look effortless. Photoshopped portraits claiming to be authentic. Beauty products sold with promises of virtue. Clean beauty, pure formulas, natural glow. We're not calling it piety anymore, but the language is familiar. It's still about being seen as better, without being seen trying. And don't even get started on aging. Wrinkles are fine lines, something to be erased with creams, lasers, or filters that literally blur your face into nothing. You're supposed to remain youthful forever, but naturally. Don't age, but don't look like you're fighting it. Don't look old, but don't act like you care either. Sound familiar? That's a straight-up Gothic remix of the same medieval pressure to appear untouched by time. Want to wear makeup? You better make it invisible. Want to be sexy? Better make it accidental. Want to be noticed, but not too much. Complimented, but not envied. Desirable, but only in ways that won't scare the people doing the desiring. In short, you still can't win. Because somewhere deep down, society still loves a woman who disappears into her beauty, who glows without effort, who ages without changing, who speaks without being loud. And if you've ever felt exhausted by that, it's not your fault. You were born into a system that's been refining this performance for centuries. That voice in your head saying, you need to fix this when you see your reflection, that's a medieval monk still whispering across time, the ad campaign that promises radiant skin and inner confidence, That's a 14th century sermon wrapped in a Sephora receipt. And those filtered photos of flawless people who swear they woke up like this. Tapestries, every last one of them. There's a reason these ideals persist. They sell things, they keep you busy, they keep you doubting, and they stop you from asking better questions about value, about power, about what happens when you choose to opt out. Because here's the secret most people don't want to admit. Beauty isn't truth, it's theatre. And you've been a leading lady in someone else's script for way too long. But here's the radical part. You're still here. You've survived the centuries, the plucked hairlines, the corseted ribs, the sickly pale faces, the saintly smiles, the powdered lies. You, sitting here, reading this, have outlived every lie they told you about what a woman should look like. You are proof that beauty does not own you.